live. Go 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 live. Hopefully that is now working. And hopefully... Hello and welcome to the Washington Naval Treaties during 1920s and 30s. What was their biggest mistake and missed opportunity? This is Patreon 82, as suggested by SteveClarke. There is a link to Patreon down below. As a rule, what we have done is every month we have suggestions go through from the patrons, and then the patrons get to vote as to what they what of those suggestions gets turned into a whole long video. The reason I do it this way is because instead of just trying to answer the question, I try and give a whole lecture about the whole of the thing. And so if I tried to do it about all of the questions that you put in, it would be a nightmare. So I cheat and I make you select for me the questions I'm going to do a whole presentation on. Because I can't choose. Because you give me so many good questions. So, this is the joy. As you know, this month there is one of the brew ships has been turned into a patron as well, because one of the patron discussions is about how to build wooden ships, and I've already did a long patrol sort of on that subject back at the beginning of the year, but I do realise where they're coming from, and I think to do it differential enough, what I'll do is I'll work through the book, so I've turned the brew ships into it. Here's my microphone working. Hopefully it is, and it should be. It's the new microphone, and it's whilst yes, it's got the old thing on. This is the new microphone. How does it differ from the old one? Well, to be honest, it's smaller, but perfectly formed. With OBS, it gets weird if you try to run it from multiple drives. I'm honestly, let's put it this way, there is a lot of things I'm considering doing, and one of those things is, to do it properly, I need more space. And I also need to probably put the monitors up on a monitor mount, and all sorts of things. And these are things which are all things worthwhile considering, but we need to first, as a family, make a decision as to whether we are going to do a massive investment into this house, and get it fixed up for future needs, or whether we are going to move. Now, I'm of the move category because I think even if we invested, I'd want to move anyway, because as much as I love this house, I returned sort of thing, because I was travelling around a lot, so I put my stuff in the home, and then during COVID I was at home with the family, which is good, because I could look after my mum and sister who were shielded. And I do, looking ahead, think it's sensible for me to live very close. But the trouble is, I can't afford to buy anywhere that close to where I live, because Epsom Mule is lovely, but its housing market is extortionate, and is designed for people who mostly work in the financial security sector. It really is. And so, especially for what I would like, because I'd like a house with a garden. Which sounds strange, but I like having dogs. And in my experience, whilst it's great fun to walk a dog, if you have to take a dog for a walk every single time it needs to go to the loo, that does make life interesting. So, yeah. I'm hoping we move, and I'm hoping to move somewhere which we've been looking at places. We have been looking at them. They have annexes, and I would have an annex. So I would have, and we've had this happen before, you know, we had things like, actually on stream, my mum, love her dearly, but she managed to fall awkwardly and couldn't get up, so I had to go help her get up, etc., because I was a big surprise, let's put it that way, when I was born. So they don't need me for many things, but when they do need me, it's good to have me nearby, and I'd feel happier that way. But I'd also would really like my own kitchen, as far away from my sister's kitchen as possible. She's trying to. She's trying. So, hello Michael Cooch, hello Mark Harkness, hello nice to go everyone. Hello, John Shea. Hello, Rapper Roseback. Hello, SteveClarke. Hello, Calvin Gusberg. Hello, DH89. Hello, Tilly Maluka. Hello, DG40. Hello, Jacob. Hello, Runon. Hello, David Goulding. Hello, Longbow. Hello, Malaga. And hello to Shrike. And hello, everyone. How are we doing? SteveClarke, I'm not surprised you're very happy when you've spent the whole day in a living history museum. There are lots of very nice... so it's a treaty microphone. Actually, to show you all... This is my old microphone. Okay? It's a Razer Siren Elite. This is my new microphone. If I take that off it, because this actually came from the Razer Elite. If I add a little bit more play into the material, that will make life a little bit easier. I can do that. And I can quickly do that. And I can go... There you go. Sort of... This one looks more rounded, but ultimately and less chonky, and this one certainly feels heavier. But, honestly, this one does seem a lot better. And I tend to put this on top. Just because I think that makes it look cute. And also does stop certain things happening. There you go. Check your sound, Doc. It should be full. It should be full, and... Yeah. That should be all good. Steven, the sound should be okay. And that's the way I've been recording all day and I've been perfectly fine. Jacob, Steven, is there a headphone still plugged in yours? Because I've turned my PC volume down. Oh, I want the headphones. Okay. Alright. Thank you, Shrike. It's always fun with all these things. It is always fun. And, yeah, I have recorded Long Patrol for this. So Long Patrol will go up on Saturday. I've recorded pretty much all of next... I've got 2 videos to record. I've got the Tuesday and the Thursday video for next week to record tomorrow at some point. The Thursday video is a bit of a surprise. Because you all noticed I didn't ask for suggestions. Normally when I'm going to be travelling, I ask for suggestions. But I'm doing something naughty with the Thursday video. It is coming from a patron suggestion, but it's something that hasn't been voted for, but I just feel that that person has put this suggestion forward so often. And it is right in the ballywhack of this channel that I felt like I should do it. And I've got 3 suggestions actually that while I'm talking to you before we get into this and while people hopefully join. There is something coming up which is on this list here, but people have not really been making suggestions for it. You'll notice that viewer suggestion number 3 is on the 29th of August, which is every time when you if you suggest, and there's a viewer suggestion number 4 coming up in October. If you suggest topics which you would like to see covered in the long patrols, which are the Year of Technology long patrols, and they fit with them, I add them in. So 29th of August, I haven't yet seen a suggestion for it from any of you. There were many suggestions for number 1, and Cub Caribou was one. And there are many suggestions for number 2, JDPT 19's Learning Lessons from War 1. But number 3, I've had no suggestions yet. The audio should not be low. According to my settings, it's at maximum temperature. Rather maximum volume. What's the biggest mixed opportunity not removing BT? Okay, what I'm going to say is, if the audio is fine, put a smiley face, like I've just put in the chat. If the audio is fine, please. There are all sorts of interesting things going on, but I just want to check, because it is a new microphone, and I think I've got the settings okay. If it's not fine, put a upset face. I want to try and work out what's going on. My coach, that's what I'm sort of doing for the Thursdays. For the first 2 Thursdays in September as well, I'm going to do that. Okay, lots of smiley faces, so I'm going to hope the sound's okay. Right then. In other good news, my car is running around quite happily, touch wood a moment. So I'm very happy with that. And before you ask, she's been christened War Sprite. Okay? Please note, W-A-R, or space, Sprite. So the original name for War Sprite, that became War Sprite, but that's what my car's been commissioned, War Sprite. Thank you, Jacob. I will put it into the list. If you can make sure it's a comment which I've been added in, I will make sure I can go track it down. But no, I will say that for the viewer suggestion videos, I usually look for suggestions from non-patrons in the comments, because my theory is that to an extent that's me doing something nice for the people who, for whatever reason, aren't a patron and therefore don't have the opportunity to make their suggestions. So, for example, there are a couple I know who are very regular followers on this channel who've been subscribed from the beginning, but they can't afford to be a patron, and that's perfectly fine, because I'm thankful to anyone who can, but I understand people who can't, and I couldn't afford to be at the moment. And yeah, so I tend to look for the suggestions from people who aren't patrons, because patrons do get their suggestions. But also on the patron suggestion front, as said, the Thursday videos, which are this Thursday and the first 2 Thursdays in Thursday coming up, and the 2 Thursdays in September, are I have shamelessly gone to the patron suggestions and gone, this video consistently gets votes, but has never managed to reach the top 2. This one hasn't, and this one hasn't. So I've taken 3 out. Junior Han, don't you think the Rhino APC? She's a Volvo. Calling her a Rhino APC is being, well, in a nice way, understating her strength. She's a Volvo. French World War I battleships. Nice day, everyone. Do you want to make me cry? I managed to get through the entirety of the video. I'm going to do doing the treaty capital ships in a couple of weeks' time, and that's causing me enough crying. over French capital ships. To be honest, today caused me enough crying over the French. So, shameless book plug. What would one of my videos be without a shameless book plug? Second edition coming soon. Available pre-order, USNI, and Pen and Sword, depending on where you are in the world. Which one applies to you? I'm also told there are some available on Amazon, and you might be able to even pre-order on Amazon. I'm not sure. But USNI, Pen and Sword, they are my publishers in the UK and in America. For this book, I am, as you all know, possibly working, or hopefully no, I've probably done, working on some self-published books, which I'm going to publish via Kindle and other e-readers. But again, I just had an interesting conversation in the last couple of days with a certain museum about the systems, and when I said I was going to be putting it out on more than just Kindle, that added on to the price of the license fee for the pictures. So, yeah, the scenario for these books is that one is 90% I'm happy with, are able to go to editors. One is at 75% I'm happy with, able to go to 75% will be able to go to editors when I'm finished that. Another one is at roughly 50%. But the thing is, none of the they only have the pictures which, in the nicest way, my good friend Drakinefel has allowed me to have for free, allocated them so far, because he is very generous and kind. Not necessarily all the pictures I need. And I need some pictures which only a certain organisations have. Although I do plan on spending some money going around other archives in the UK and having and basically chatting them up and going, do you have original pictures here that I can use? But that's also going to be money. But it seems to be a cheaper option than actually trying to pay a certain archive for them. Richard, she would drive off and beat up other cars up. She's a Volvo. She'll do it politely. No, good. For those of us in first edition, TBD, what's new in the first, new and second edition? Basically, the second edition has got Nubian in its table, and I fixed a few of the interesting things which had crept in during the editing process, which me and the chief editor hadn't noticed had crept in from some of the other other edits going around, because there have been lots of people. It was edited and everything during COVID, and everyone was very, very stressed, and interesting things happened, which are no one's fault. Ultimately, they're my fault because I'm the author, and so the buck stops here. And they've been corrected. Those boats do their best to avoid the damage. As you'll notice, that there is a little sort of we have either it's the wind or a bomb blast going off. There's a debate, and the artist very nicely will not comment as to which it is. Malaga, out of curiosity, can you share just how expensive those picture licenses would be? It would be, when I was just saying, apparently when I was just referring to Kindle is what they inferred it as, it was listed as £270 per image, or £270.50 per image. With other ebooks added, it goes up to £320 per image. So yeah, 5 pictures, that's 1,500 quid. That's the morbid curiosity answer, Malaga. A research trip around the UK for going to 3 different archives in the UK and driving all the way around and going to Newcastle, Glasgow, and the Wirral would cost me £2,000. I.e., it's almost the same price to buy pictures as it is to go and do the research trip. Just 5 pictures. For a book which you're planning to have 60 pictures in, I've got 36. I've got another 20. I've got another 18 of my own from that I took aboard HMCS Sackville, and then the remainder that I was hoping to have. The remaining 6 I was hoping to have from this particular source, and I've cut it down to 5, and I'll find a 6th one elsewhere. But if I wanted a 6th, that would be £1,920. I think Drag's already done so much stuff about my book. I think if we did any more, that would be basic, blatant self-promotion at a certain point. Right. I'm glad you're Joss Funk that your youngest likes the cover a lot. That's like sort of that's what they can charge. Hello, John Luke. So, without much further ado, let us begin. So, I have some interesting pictures for you up here, and I could be about to run afoul of Getty, but we'll leave that to one side. We'll hope they don't notice and don't complain. That'll be fun. So, missed opportunity or mistake? What is the difference? Well, the criteria I'm using for this scenario is it has to, for all these things, is they have to be mostly attributable to treaties, not the 10-year rule, not the economic downturn of the Washington. That's what it is. Washing Naval Treaty, not Washington Naval Treaty. Frigate. I didn't notice that when I was recording the Long Patrol. Washing Naval Treaty. Oh, goodness gracious me. There are going to be people critiquing that going, you didn't notice. I'm going to go, no, because I don't read my PowerPoint slides. I actually just do it from memory. Oh, my notes. Yay, done. Washington. So. Hello, Amelia. Right, if we're going to talk about what is a missed opportunity versus a mistake, okay, sometimes these are things which are viewed in retrospect. Over the years, I've taken my cousins and various friends, etc. We've gone to many concerts together. When Taylor Swift recently came, I'm not a Swiftie, I would never claim to be or anything like that. Although I have to say, of the options which my cousins occasionally pick to go to concerts, she is more enjoyable than some of the others. And frankly, you have never been more disturbed than when you have seen your sister, who is your elder sister, literally mooning over... Who was it? I think it's Westlife, but it might have been Boyzone. I have no idea. They all gel into one for me. That's a scary experience for any person to see, to go with their female relatives and just watch them. So, nicest way, Taylor Swift is good, and it's usually quite fun. I didn't go with them last time. I usually go with them, but I didn't. And so that's a missed opportunity of family time, of being able to spend time with family. I'll be able to do another one, and I'll do other things. I did it because I was busy with work, so I didn't go with them. But that's a missed opportunity. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about something which is something you could have done, which would have been fun, but you do something else. It's not a disaster for you. Why do I have the American Airlines there? Well, about a couple of years before COVID hit, a couple of years before COVID, I think it was. My dad got an offer to go to America to go do some work over there, and he was going to be near about New Jersey, and he said, "Would I like to come with him?" We would have spent a couple of days going around USS New Jersey together, and I couldn't get away from work at the time, and so he was going to have to go back in a couple of years anyway, so I just didn't think of it. And the thing is, at no age do you really think that your parents are mortal until they turn out to be mortal. It's just not something which really occurs to people. Even me, it didn't occur. Year later, he got ill and he unfortunately died. And he'd have been going back the next year after that. Actually, that turned out to be the year of COVID starting as well. And so yeah, I haven't got to see New Jersey, and I didn't get to go see it with my dad. So that's a mistake. That is something I can't take back. That is something which means I haven't seen New Jersey, but it also means that it's something I can't replicate that experience. I could go with Dract next week. Or whenever he's going, or I could go with all the shipshape crew, or I could go with anyone else, but I can't go with my dad. I can't do that. That's a mistake. Not doing that. I should have. When I look back, that's always going to be something I'm going to think, well, I should have done that. Portugal mooning over. Might be a British phrase. Rather than mooning when you're showing your behind, mooning over is when they're going. Okay? And seriously, when you're with enough of your female relatives and they're all doing the same, going, who was it? I think it might have been Boyzone, because I think at one point it was Robbie Williams was on stage. I think Robbie Williams was on stage. And I quite like his music. He did a very good jazz album a few years ago, and I quite like him. But yeah, they were. It was fun. It was an experience never. Yeah, it was an experience never to be repeated. So basically, this is the example. I'm trying to give you examples which can make sense of what is a missed opportunity versus a mistake. And sometimes you don't know what is a mistake until you're looking back. I didn't realise there was a treaty about the cleanliness of naval ships. No, it's a surprise. No, so the Boeing 737 MAX is a mistake. Yes. It could be argued to be. It could also be argued that it needs to be more work. A technology lesson, as Paul from Chicago is putting. Hi, Paul Amos. Now, the other criteria for this entire video is what do I think is the biggest one. So, for example, John Salford put the biggest missed opportunity mistake was to fail to stand as a destroyer secondary arm earlier than he did. I'd like to have seen a high-angle dual-purpose mount for the 4.7-inch quick-firing gun. We all would. A properly dual-purpose 4.7-inch mount would have been a very useful gun. But the thing is that the biggest missed opportunity and biggest mistake? And this is coming from someone who has done a whole book about destroyers, who is very interested in destroyers. Is that the biggest missed opportunity and mistake that they could have done? Honestly, it isn't. So, let's start off with the countries. But first, Empire submarines. Now, this is always an interesting one when I produce this, because people talk about the Empire cruiser plan, they talk about the Dominion cruisers, they talk about the Dominion sloops and all these things, and I'll be talking about those. But you have to remember, under the Washington Naval Treaty, there is no limit on submarines. There is none. There is no limit on submarines. So, quite easily, there could have been a construction program across the empire of building submarines to defend them. And imagine if Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, Canada all had 20-odd submarines in service. I know Australia did have some submarines in service, but imagine if they'd all had 20 to 30 submarines they'd built up during the 1920s. They built up their own submarine force. Imagine that. Now, the thing was, you can argue the tech of the submarines in the 1920s is not that great, because submarine technology tends to do dun, 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 dun. Basically, rises and plateaus, rises and plateaus, rises and plateaus. Don't ask me why, but submarine tech, if we look at it through history, does have the rise-plateau approach. The theory I've heard a few times has been it's to do with the scenario they're operating in, that before you can develop a next generation technology, you first need to get used to working with the current generation technology. And because of the difficulty of operating submarines and the community, etc., the size of the community and the breadth of the community and the specific environments that are doing it, this means that it slows down the improvement cycle. But these are all options which we can consider. The reality is, Empire submarines are an interesting thing. But are they an individual or a collective missed opportunity? I would say they're a collective missed opportunity, because not even the British government really gets behind them. And the thing is, they would have been really quite useful, because let's consider this from a World War II perspective. Imagine Australia had 30-odd submarines in service, and New Zealand had 30-odd submarines in service, and India had 30-odd submarines in service, and, well, Canada and South Africa have 30-odd submarines in service. The odds are there's quite a few submarines operating around the Indian Ocean, which, in this way, things like the Graf Spee might have bumped into and gone, ouch, that's painful. Or alternatively, and some more thing, think about what happens with that larger submarine force for the British Empire when World War II breaks out. You might well reinforce Singapore, etc., and a forward submarine line with more submarines. In which case, a Japanese invasion of Malaysia might well have to get past a lot of submarines. In which case, Singapore might not fall. And you might have a defensive line able to be maintained a bit further, because the British might well have to do the same policy as the Americans did, where basically their submarine service was what held the line for a full year, arguably. It was the submarines which really kept the Japanese limited in terms of logistics. Well, imagine a load of British submarines and British and Dominion submarines involved in that. The forces that would unleash. Why did they not go for it? Well, honestly, because they're worried about the next generation of tech and they thought submarines might improve, but also the British are working on Aztec, and a lot of British politicians and even some admirals have a constant desire of the idea of, can we get rid of submarines by treaty? The trouble is, getting rid of a submarine by treaty is just as difficult as getting rid of bombers by treaty, in that once the technology is out of the Pandora's box, no one is shoving it back. No one is shoving it back. And that's the problem with submarines. They have lots of ideas, but... And interesting about... Night Secretaries mentioned the U-boats. I'm probably thinking about the German vessels. But let's be honest, the U-class and the smaller coastal submarines would have been the perfect submarines for the Empire submarine fleet. Those sort of smaller vessels would have been perfect for it. Daniel Phillips, you're asking a lot of very interesting questions in the chat, and today I can't really get to them as sort of that scenario, because this is about the mistakes of the effects of the treaty, not the treaty process itself. But yeah, we might do videos around that one, and if you want to ask them in brew ships on Sunday or something like that, I'd be more than welcome to. Happy to chat through them in detail then. John South, I prefer Dutch to build a county or a Leander, but they were cutting costs, so York Air Refuser Group will far from perfect will be better than Java, Sumatra, and De Ruyter. Java, Sumatra, and De Ruyter were not bad vessels. They are focused on the Dutch needs. And you can say the Dutch would be better going for bigger sails, but there are issues for the Dutch. I've just done a video on their 1914 battleship project, and that's coming out next week. And there are issues around that. Leslie Mitchell, would that not mean more people would have spent more money on ASW? Well, let's be honest, if we get into the ASW thing, more people will spend more money on ASW. The British spend the most money of anyone on ASW in the interwar years. And even the British are having issues with dealing with submarines in World War II, because it's a constant balance. And it's a constant battle between the tech and the wits and the abilities of the submariners and the tech and the wit of the submarine hunting forces. So it's there. I would also point out that one of the things we're going to be talking about tonight is one nation did actually develop anti-submarine sonar, etc., and didn't deploy it because it had limited construction capabilities. So yes, more countries might invest in some anti-submarine technology, but they also might not. You have to remember the Japanese, they don't invest because they feel very confident with their anti-submarine capabilities because of what they've done in World War I. They think they've cracked the submarine problem to an extent. They then realize a bit too late, and they don't have the infrastructure to implement it. So it's not just how much money you're spending on anti-submarine warfare. That means you're not spending money on other things. So again, that's the thing. Is if they're all spending money on anti-submarine warfare capabilities, that's good. That means they're not spending money on other things. Aussie submarines would need to be huge, like US fleet subs. We need to AUKUS knowledge it. Aussie submarines would probably need to be T-boats. And you have to remember, T&S boats did operate from Australia as part of the Pacific War. So yeah, they would have to have fuel tanks, extended range fuel tanks. So probably not U-boats, but U-class vessels. But there again, if they do have U-class vessels, the thing is that's going to be an extra defensive layer for Australia. It might mean the things like the raid on Darwin don't happen. Remember, how do I verify disposal or compliance of a ship design to go as seen? Exactly. How do you verify how many are constructed? Hi, Discovery. Hope you're well. Honestly, if we're thinking about for this period, we would probably be looking at vessels like the well, You might notice I've stuck an S-class boat up here, because they're from the 1929 constructions. They're preceded by the Rainbow class, and they're a good example of what might have been considered. But the O boats, the Odin class especially, were built for a lot of for a lot of scenarios, and the O class were originally, how do I put this, were built to be used in the Pacific Navy, and originally the Royal Australian Navy did order 2. The Oberon was built for the Royal Navy, then the Ottaway and Oxley were supposed to be built for the Royal Australian Navy, and they built 3 modified vessels for the Chilean Navy, the Captain O'Brien class. So yeah, probably be looking at O-class vessels, and their sort of likely successors would be the sort of the basis of this group. And they had a range of 8,400 nautical miles at 10 knots on the surface, and 70 nautical miles at 4 knots submerged. So yeah, O-boats would probably be what we're looking at, or something like that. Because the L-class had been constructed at the end of World War I, and the O-class on the next set of boats really produced. There's always a lot of love for Beatty on this channel from Paul from Chicago. Hello, Richard Gross. Everyone loves Admiral Beatty on this channel, don't they? Oh no, they don't. As a rule, we absolutely are absolutely upset that he even gets the position. He is a classic example of, he was a very good captain, and then he's promoted based on his experience, his qualities as a captain, and he turns out to not be such a good admiral. But he's a very well politically connected admiral, so actually he turns out to be not... Well, he's actually a horrendous First Sea Lord from the point of view of the Fleet Air Arm, and some of the decisions he makes for the Fleet Air Arm, i.e. not using the Admiral class, using the Courageous, Glorious and Furious, i.e. Fisher's Follies, and allowing the Fleet Air Arm to be transferred to the Royal Air Force's control. But yeah, he does some other interesting decisions. But actually, broadly speaking, as First Sea Lord, he does actually stand up for Navy quite well, and does manage to hold off the worst of some of the people like Gede's Axe would have been. He was actually a pretty good captain. If you look at his record as a ship's captain and some of the operations he got up to, Beatty did pretty well. The thing is, this is also part of the trouble you have to remember for Fleet Command, and this features into this session, it features into a lot of the discussions we're going to have today. It's very easy. It's very easy to be a good captain when you're trained your whole career for it, but you're not trained your whole career to become an admiral. Usually, at a certain point, you become a good captain. They go, well, this person's been a good captain. Let's see what I like as an admiral. They're not really trained for it. You could argue that being a flag captain is training for it, but you're still running your ship. And it's a problem. It's a problem. So, sorry, Dr. Clarke, treated really perhaps not. I thought something was Royal Navy. Someone recently did a biography on him. Yeah, I've got it up here. It's not a biography. It's sort of, well, it is sort of a biography, but it's its own diary. It's been published, and it's been very limited. It's very curtailed, interesting enough, in some of its contents. But it's still a very good source to have, and it's a diary of a naval constructor. Where is it? It's somewhere in my office, he says, looking around his collection of books. And it's basically, he's a naval constructor. He is Royal Navy, but he's not Royal Navy. He's a Royal Navy constructor, which means he's a civilian naval architect who's been trained up in the Admiralty Dockyard and Admiralty system. Not that book. Not that book. Not that one. Whoa, I was literally reading it like 2 hours ago. No, not that one. Similar cover though to that though. Literally reading it 2 hours ago. Nope. Not that one. Where have I put it? Oh, there it is. This one. Diary of a Wartime Constructor by Susanna Goodall. Edited by Ian Buxton. Ian does a very good job. Slightly annoyed they didn't ask me, but, you know, there again. I'm not as well known for editing diaries as Ian is. So, we've gone to Canada. Now, this is not going to be a long discussion because, well, it's Canada. And their major issue is that they don't invest in their navy. They don't invest in defence at all. They're prepared to put money into the British system. They're prepared to put money into buying up British debt and giving Britain very, very favourable terms on debt. They are prepared to invest financially in security, but not in terms of actually investing in their own navy. And as it became a bit of a meme in the year of the cruiser on this channel, in that the Canadian cruisers and the Canadian cruisers would end up having horrid ends, in that they were usually found abandoned, derelict, and sinking because the Canadian government hadn't paid for their upkeep and maintenance. So there are issues. But I would say a missed opportunity in this stance is the county class cruisers, because for Canada, having them would have been a great way of tying into the wider British system, would have been a great way of defending themselves from their sea line of communications, and perhaps if they invested wisely, they could have used it to build up their own infrastructure. I built it in Canada, because Canada does have decent yards which do have the theoretical capability to build, or at least be adapted to build, a county class cruiser. And that would have been a lot of investment in infrastructure. Now, John South, I know that is one of the myths about the Royal Navy, but that isn't actually true. You said in the 19th century the only way to become an admiral was to wait for one to die. No. I know there is a myth about that, but it isn't actually the case. The Royal Navy does have Admirals of the Yellows. There is the fact that the anyone who's promoted to Admiral of Fleet never retires, which tends to be where it's come in, but you're an Admiral of Fleet, you never retire. You are always considered on call to the government. You're always considered on active service. You don't get a pension, you get your pay. So, yes, there are certain interesting things, but there are admirals do retire, they are pushed out. Usually the thing that people don't often forget about it is they get moved into the yellow. They get made a squadron, an admiral of the yellow. So they don't retire as an admiral, they're made an admiral of the yellow. So you have the admirals of the red, white and blue, who are your active admirals, and then you have the admirals of the yellow, who are your retired admirals. So that's how you retire them off. So that's that one. Now, the reason I say the county's not a light cruiser and other options, etc., is because the counties were what were being built. So the county class was supposed to be the Dominion cruiser. The Royal Navy was hoping at one point in some of the plans people were talking about getting 40 to 48 of these vessels spread across Britain and the 5 Dominions. The aim would have been for the Royal Navy to probably have about 24, i.e. 3 squadrons, and for 24 at least for the Royal Navy, and for the others to have probably at least 4 each. Now, you might notice that I said the 5 Dominions and I said 24. So, the thing is, the Royal Navy could have quite happily ended up with 28. It might need to end up with slightly more than 24, than 28 to make it work. Because they expected New Zealand probably would only be able to afford 2. So that's actually then works out as 18, and the Royal Navy needs to procure 30 to get to 48. But it could be the Royal Navy decides to get 24 and only 2 more, so they get 26, the others provide 18, and then you end up with something like 44. Okay? So it's somewhere in the region of 40 to 48 is what they were hoping to have. Basically, the red, white, and blue were the traditional divisions of the Royal Navy in terms of the van, the fleet, and the rear. So, the different colours. And that's not in this topic of this video, but I think I have done a video where I've discussed the admirals and their various rings. But if not, I will do a video at some point about it. As Paul from Chicago has put on now, an admiral of the yellow is an admiral without a post. Basically, they make a post captain an admiral, but put him on half pay and don't employ him for forced retirement. Yes, and not all captains were made admirals, and if a captain could be put on to retirement and not re-employed, and if they're not re-employed, they're not likely to get made admiral, no matter how senior. Theoretically, it's always seniority in the list, but the reality is it's seniority of serving officers in the list. There are people who are examples where this isn't the case. There are when they have sufficient political connections, but there are ways around things. Now, in the idea, there's a sort of thing of going, okay, light cruisers, so we could build more. They're not going to build more. That's the point. The nicest way, you're going to get maybe Canada to build 4. So they might as well have 2 counties as well as 2 light cruisers. And whilst you have 2 coasts, getting Canada to build 4 was considered the end goal of it. If they could get them to build 4, they'd have been very happy. As it is, they got them to build none. So yeah, but light cruisers, again, it's not much. It's not as much of a cost saving as you might think. A light cruiser and a heavy cruiser in terms of the 8-inch gun is not as different under the Washington Treaty. Remember, because the Washington Treaty doesn't differentiate between the cruiser types. Everything is limited to maximum 10,000 tons on 8-inch guns. So under the Washington Treaty, you're building a county class cruiser, because you have no limitations on large or heavy cruisers and light cruisers. And the rate of fire of the 6-inch gun, triple turret, etc., hasn't yet been developed to the point at which that overwhelms the 8-inch gun. In terms of saturation fire. Okay? So the mistake, it's the sloops. And again, this was supposed to be it's a program which was considered and put forward in the 1930s. And they don't get into it. But imagine a world where from 1922 onwards, or 1922, which they could have done, because again, under 2,000 tons sloops could have been built, where the 5 Dominion navies and the Royal Navy says they're going to build 10 a year, and they basically the Dominions each say they're going to build 2. You'd have 20 sloops being built a year. Okay? They take about a year to 18 months to be ready. By World War II, you'd have built 340. Now, you probably wouldn't have kept them all in service, but you possibly have as many as 200 in service, which would be 100 split between the 5 Dominions, which would be about 20 each. and 100 for the Royal Navy. So if you have 200 sloops in the service, and they are roughly 10 years old, and the oldest level, in 1939, you don't need to do a crash build emergency program to defend all your sea lines of communication. Now, why would this be useful for Canada? Well, most of this is all built around building up Canada's own infrastructure and investing in Canadian employment. You see, Canada has issues. If you look at it to this day, they have quite a lot of population centered in one key area. It's the Toronto, Hamilton sort of triangle area of that sort of area. That is where a vast majority of the Canadian population is. If you are keeping a consistent construction program going of sloops, slice vessels, let's say in Halifax and other places, you can actually build up those yards, those places, those cities, because you've got consistent employment. And money, when it's investing in the country, if a government, and there's a joke about Keynesians in there, but if you invest in the government, if you're a government and you invest in sort of constructing things like warships, okay, you get the warship, which is a useful thing at the end, but you're also investing in the employment of the people, you're investing in the infrastructure, you're investing in the industry, the money's going in, and it then gets used by those people within that community, which grows that community. And that money will be used many, many times and will come back in taxes many, many times over. So it's useful. You get that money back. But Canada didn't. German, we are going to get to South Africa. They are part of one of the signatory nations of the Washington Naval Treaty. Middleborough, why not do triple 8-inch notes? That's, again, as said, we're keeping this to, it has to be mostly attributable to the treaties, not the 10-year rule. So, in a nicer way, design decisions like going for twin 8-inch versus triple 8-inch turrets, etc. The British went for 4 twins rather than 3 triples because they decided that they wanted the extra survivability of having the 4 turrets. So if you knock out one, you lose 25% rather than knock out one, you lose 30%. That's their thinking. So, you know, you can make the argument 8 or 9 guns, you can make it. I would prefer, of course, 4 triple turrets, but, you know, that's 10,000 ton limitation. So for Italy. Italy. Tuning 3-4. When battlecruisers become fun times. So, mistake. The Francisco Caracola class were 34,000 tons fully loaded, i.e. you could get them under the 35,000 ton standard tonnage limitation of the naval treaties. In which case, the Italians should have demanded the right to finish off the Francisco Caracola. They should have demanded the right to finish off their battleship, because it had been launched. It should have replaced one of their older ships, but they should have finished it off. Because think about it from the perspective of long term. If the Francisco Caracola becomes the last ship you've finished and completed, and if you consider all the capabilities, and there is a whole video on this channel about the Francisco Caracola class and what they could have done to the Mediterranean, what they could have done to the world in terms of their capabilities, imagine how the Littorios would be spec'd. Okay? Imagine what the Italians would do for their navy. So not finishing off the Francisco Caracola class, it's a tragedy. But also imagine what they do to the French, because because the French are not building anything of the capabilities of the Caracola class. The French do not have anything of the capabilities of the Caracola class. Imagine what the French do when they're now next building their next battleships to Dunkirk or anything in response. They have to think all the time about the Francisco Caracola. It will become the single most powerful tool in the Italian naval arsenal of diplomatic tools. So not finishing off the Francisco Caracola itself is a massive mistake. Now, some people are saying the French would have said no and threatened to walk out. Nice English front. The thing is, that would have forced them to admit that their ships are not at the same level. And they would also get the chance to complete one ship. And considering the Americans are completing ships, the Japanese are completing ships, and the British are building 2 brand new ships, the Italians making the case that we'd like to finish one of our new ships off as well, is hardly unsurprising and hardly without precedent. So the French would have to have it and tough cookie. Plus, as you all remember from me talking about hopefully remember if you watched, the video about the signatory delegates of the Washington Naval Treaty. The French diplomatic squads sent to the Washington Naval Treaty are hardly their first-class diplomats. So walking out, no, they would think they could do a deal. It'd probably be a terrible deal for France, and it was a terrible deal for France. Remember, these are the same people who signed up to a treaty where they are the same size as the Italian Navy, which immediately strategically cripples them. So, yeah, I do not have a belief they'd walked out if the Italians got the Francisco Caracola. Also, production of 15-inch guns and shells might improve quality control. It would certainly give them a more history of it. Honestly, if the French walked out of the treaty system, that's more of a problem for them than anyone else. Also, the French are basically being brought into the treaty system because the British and the Americans are, to an extent, one is bankrolling their international security and the other one is bankrolling their economy at this point. And there is the option, of course, as using a Caracola. Although you don't need to use the Caracola itself as your carrier conversion. Because the thing is, there is also the Marcantonio Colonia, which, whilst it's not been launched, was laid down on the 3rd of March 1915 at Cantieri Navali Adara, and it was further along than the others. So I think that's the option for an aircraft carrier, would have been the Marcantonio Colonia, which is another option here, because, here's it. There's the missed opportunities. By the way, and I do want the point here to be noted, is that the Italians do develop a fairly good sonar system. The trouble is their sonar has to be, they don't develop a proper sonar in terms of they don't develop something which they can actually produce in the quantities you need to produce sonar for anti-submarine warfare. They produce a very good one which they can either fit to submarines or they can fit to their surface ships for anti-submarine warfare. The trouble is they can't produce enough for both. So in other words, that's not a properly developed sonar. If you not develop something with the infrastructure and the necessary protection around it to develop and use the numbers you need, you haven't developed a proper sonar. You developed a boutique piece of equipment which is lovely to look at, but is not any help. And again, with the Francisco Caracola and the possibly conversion one to an aircraft carrier, that would have been the Italians having an aircraft carrier in the 1920s and 30s would have been an absolute nightmare for many nations to deal with, but it would have had a massive impact on development of naval aviation. And also think about the Italian Navy with the Francisco Caracola, with her guns and her weapons, her sister as the converted aircraft carrier at the core of their naval strength and deployment. Those will be some ships, and these are 28-knot ships, so okay. That's not necessarily as fast as you'd like it to be, but 28 knots versus the Burn, which was 21.5 knots, is light years of difference. And 28 knots is the official maximum speed as well, and so that's what we have to deal with. But the reality is I'm fairly sure she can push it. Rather like the British carriers, the official maximum speed, and there's the real maximum speed. They're good things. They are lovely things. Remember, not national statement, maybe a treaty one. Why restrict warships by type? Why not just say, here's your total tonnage, build what you want? Because it's going to sound strange, but total tonnage is easier to lie over than individual classifications. And they were trying to make a treaty that was in some way enforceable. In some way enforceable. Renan, slagging off politely the French-Russian naval treaty. Yeah, I didn't realise I was being that polite. There has never been a country less well served by their delegation to a conference, I could argue, than the French delegation to the Washington Naval Treaty. Never. Italian doctrine for aircraft and aircraft carrier in the 1920s, if they have an aircraft carrier, they'll actually develop something. And it could be very interesting. Yes, the Royal Air Force of the Italian Royal Air Force is probably going to kick up a snit over who flies from the carrier. But the thing, but it would be they'd have time to sort it out. And the Italians do have a habit of producing short runs of very good aircraft. So if they have a single aircraft carrier to supply, imagine the aircraft that ship has. Imagine the effects that has on naval aviation as a whole. Come on, the Italian aircraft. They're usually, in the nicest way, they're not things you can mass produce, but they're usually individually quite beautiful and quite effective. They don't work for a long time, but they look really good. But getting spare parts is an absolute nightmare. But they look very good, and they have great stats. So the thing is, imagine the impact they'd have on the whole world's development of naval aviation. It'd be really quite cool. Don't have likely a carrier conversion will be faster. The Brits got Eagle up to 25 knots officially, and she was based on 21 knot battleship. Yes, so goodness knows how fast the Italian aircraft carrier converted from a Francisco Caracola would get up to a theoretically 28 knot battleship, the hull with with all that power. We're now having a debate over what the Italian aircraft would be, but it's there's quite a lot of different things. What was it broke the Italian Empire? World War I, something else. World War II. The Italian Empire didn't really exist, but it grew after World War One. It appeared the Abyssinia crisis grew it enormously, and it disappeared after World War II. British nightmare. Italy two completed Francisco Caracola battleships and the other two converted aircraft carriers. At which point the Royal Navy would be seriously adjusting the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty. I.e., there's the Washington Naval Treaty you'd get if that was completed, And also, let's be honest, before it's even the British Nightmare, the French are crying at that point. The French Navy is going, look at what you've done to us politicians. Look at what you've done to us, to France. Yeah. Right, so, next one. South Africa. Okay. So, South Africa has the Cape of Good Hope and sits astride one of the world's most important trade routes. It is a critical juncture of the British Empire. Yes, the Suez Canal is the primary trade route. Yes, South Africa can go. We're a long way from anywhere, so who's going to get to us? But also, the South Africans could have been of vital utility to the Royal Navy. Let's be honest, a missed opportunity having a county-class cruiser in the South African Navy, a couple of them, especially 4 of them, would probably mean that in World War II there'd at least be 2, if not 3, hanging around South Africa when a certain vessel called the Graspé tried to go past into the Indian Ocean. In fact, I would honestly say if I was the captain of the Graspé, Ludendorff, if I was them, I would probably go, I'm not going that way. Because why would you? Even if you win the battle versus one county-class cruiser, you're going to be damaged enough. Where are you going to get to? And there's going to be 2 more hunting you down. Now there are problems for them, for all the South Africans, in terms of crewing these ships. They'd possibly either have to put an extreme burden on a far smaller population, or they would have to actually start widening the franchise of recruitment for the Navy. It's an interesting scenario. It could have had quite an interesting effect on a country. So I would argue it's a missed opportunity. Mistake, though. And the thing is, the South Africans couldn't build a county-class cruiser. They don't have the infrastructure to it. But they could have built up the infrastructure to build, and quite easily started building some sloops. And again, they could have done escorts of convoys. Now, is this to help them? Well, South Africa isn't a net importer of food. They're a net exporter. They're not a net importer of raw materials, but a net importer of manufactured goods, and they are at a critical point. So if they had their own sloops, etc., they could do a lot of escorting in that area. And that would have made them incredibly valuable to Britain, because basically, if South Africa has even a small force of sloops, then in any scenario where the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean gets blocked off, i.e. war with Italy, South Africa suddenly becomes one of the most vital navies in the world, because the Royal Navy now has to escort the vessels to South Africa, and then the South Africans can take over the convoying of the vessels up the coast elsewhere. It's a massive enhancement for them. Now, Black Master, what would the names be for the South African county-class cruisers? That's an interesting thing. Honestly, there haven't been enough South African named ships for me to really get into it. But I wouldn't be surprised if... well, they probably named some after the larger towns in larger cities in sort of South Africa. So you possibly have HMS Cape Town, those sort of things. But it could well be regions as Blackburn, as SteveClarke is suggesting, or Good Hope, as well as Gok Bay is suggesting. There are options. But yeah, sloops would have been useful. They could have built them themselves, and infrastructure-wise, honestly, having cruisers and sloops are the best things for any of these dominions to do. And again, this is something that's an opportunity under the Washington Treaty, this is an opportunity under the Washington Treaty, London Treaty, all the treaties. So this is the mistake, because under the Washington Treaty they could have got this. And it would have been useful. Now, Michael Couch has gone in with, for a cheaper solution, South Africa develops a substantial airborne patrol recce. Tows both service raiders and subs and comparatively cheap and lower manpower requirement. No and no and no. Sorry. Let me explain why. The primary threat in your 1920s, when you think about it, is surface raiders. The ability in 1920s for aircraft to take out ships at sea in 1920s if they're maneuvering is unlikely at best to impossible in the 1920s, because again, aircraft haven't got the weapon systems in the 1920s. Yes, the Royal Navy have the Sopwith Cuckoo, and yes, they have various torpedo bombers that they launch from aircraft carriers and those sort of things. But those are mass torpedo attacks. If you have a patrol aircraft up, you're going to have to develop a significant establishment of not just patrols, but also air bases. And once you get into this, it actually doesn't become any cheaper. In fact, it becomes a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult to do. Because people think, okay, yes, we've got a squadron that can cover all this area. One squadron can't. You need more than one squadron, and you need multiple air bases, and you need all the infrastructure to support them. So, actually, the cruisers in the 1920s are the better solution. You are perfectly right. Once you get into the late 1930s, you can do that. And especially once you're post 1940s, etc., you can do that, and that will assist you. But in the 1920s, no. And also, again, dealing with submarines, you're going to make force submarines to submerge, which is fine. It's a good thing. That limits their capabilities, as we've got onto this thing. A submerged submarine is not able to maneuver fast, not able to attack. You know, it does attack from submerged, but it's a case of if it's stuck down. But you've got nothing that can really go prosecute it, and nothing that can prosecute it if it's underwater with aircraft in the 1920s. So that's your limitation. So, whilst you are right in certain sense, you're not right going forward in the 1920s. You're right going forward in about late 1930s. Also, Michael, as again, you're going, I agree, air won't kill the surface raider, but we'll spot them, and there's the most surface raiders. RN Task Force saying hello. Why did the RN want to have a task force down in South Africa? If you look in World War II, where is there not an RN task force? One of the reasons why the Graf Spee is able to get away with what it's doing and able to go past South Africa is because the RN don't have task forces routinely operating down in South Africa. Why? Because the South Africans don't contribute to them, and because they have other areas which are higher risk to cover. So if South Africa wants them covered by a task force, they're going to have their own ships to pay into the system. That's the other thing. If South Africa has 4 cruisers, yeah, let's say the British need them elsewhere, so the British might well put some cruisers down there to cover so that the South African cruisers can be used elsewhere. But again, World War II is a classic example of, once you look at it, you soon realise, hang on, the British are putting the assets where there are nations which have contributed more and are part of it, and that's one of the reasons which does catch them out of South Africa. And South Africa's lack of investment in defence and paying into the Empire programme really shows up when the British are basically forced to invade Madagascar, because the fear is of the Japanese doing to Madagascar what they've done to Vietnam, i.e. taking over a Vichy colony without any trouble at all, without any resistance. And South Africa has no defences. So basically, if Japan took over Madagascar, then South Africa is completely gone. And there are whole treaties and reports going through 1920s and 30s of the British government pretty much begging South Africa to do the bare minimum of investment spending. It's kind of a fun thing when you look at some of the conversations we have today with countries which are NATO members, and you realise that it's been a consistent problem that some countries have just gone, well, we don't need to do this because we're part of this system and there are these big countries who will come and fight us and defend us. And it's been an ongoing thing. Politicians have been trying to get away with not spending on defence for a long time. Aren't logistics that the same thing the US ran to Pearl Harbor? There is the old, often quoted thing from Winston Churchill, and this goes for long-range maritime patrol aircraft as much as heavy bombers. There is nothing more immobile than a bomber squadron. It's more difficult to maneuver. Within its area, it has the ability to strike anywhere within range of that airfield. You try and move it from airfield to airfield. That's a nightmare. And there's all sorts of fun things. At the time, South Africa had 4 provinces: Transvaal, Natal, Orange Free State, and Cape Good Hope. Those could be named for the kind of class if South Africa had bought them. Could be. But no, it's you're making good suggestions, Michael. The trouble is, it's the reality. You're making suggestions which are very correct when you read some of the history backwards and some of the history that's come out about these things. When you're looking at the history and the reality of the 1920s versus the perception, the reality is very different from the perception. Admittedly, I'm biased because I'm an historian. I will admit that level of bias, but I will also say that the aircraft, and I'm a naval aviation historian. That's what my PhD is. I looked at aircraft carriers and development of naval aviation. And the consistent problem you had was you have the people talking about what aviation will be able to do, and they would be talking about in the 1920s, aircraft will do this. There's the reality of what they're able to spec aircraft for, because what they think they can be spec to do, and there's the reality of what aircraft can do at the time when they're talking. So there's what aircraft in service can currently do, what aircraft in the next generation of aircraft will be able to do, and what the aircraft the people are talking about, the theorists especially, but also sometimes some of the operators are talking about aircraft will be able to do, are very different things. And some of those things, Gilio Duhay is a good example. Some of his predictions about aircraft that were supposed to come about in the next 20 years haven't come about to this day. There are no aircraft wandering around the world able to drop 100 tons of bombs. If the example, I think I did use this actually in my PhD thesis when he was talking about it. He was talking about they'll all be able to drop and within the next 20 years, aircraft will be able to drop 100 tons of bombs as a routine, and they will be able to decimate city. A single bomb will be able to decimate a single city with just this bomb load of 100 tons of biological bombs. Was usually what he preferred, as in biological warfare. But the actual B-52, well, that maximum carrying ordnance is 32 tons of bombs, not 100 tons of bombs. There's a big difference in that. And yes, you can then argue, well, nuclear weapons come about. But the thing is, he was arguing it would be routine war and standard deployment would be to decimate whole cities with bombers. Whereas nuclear weapons have immediately become strategic weapons which are used more as a deterrent than as a combat multiplier. And the Blackburn is the Washington Naval Treaty. That is, you are right, that is one of the aircrafting area. There's also some very interesting aircraft wandering around that period. They were perfectly capable for the 1920s, but they are not capable of doing those jobs. You could point to the whole, and again with the treaty, you could point to the Spider's Web and the whole scenario of the anti-submarine warfare patrols from the UK in terms of the seaplanes and what they achieved. And you could go, well, they could set up a seaplane service. Quite right. Seaplane service would be very interesting. But if you consider the sheer number of seaplanes the British had to build and deploy for that to work, and had to buy from America as well as from Britain. And the fact that those seaplanes were backed up by destroyer patrols, torpedo boat patrols, and cruiser patrols. And sloops, in flag class sloops wandering around. It's a very, very in-depth system to achieve that aim. I think the Lockheed C5 Galaxy, that can... Well, its maximum takeoff weight is, I think, roughly it can, in terms of empty weight, is 172 tons. I think. Yeah. 172 tons. Its takeoff weight, its empty weight. And its maximum takeoff weight, including fuel, is 381 tons. So theoretically it can carry 110 tons, but that includes fuel. And they have to take a lot of fuel because they will burn a lot of fuel moving it. They have and their range shrinks down dramatically with payload. If they're carrying a 54-ton payload, their range is 4,800 nautical miles. Their range is 2,300 nautical miles with maximum cargo capacity. And that's a carrier. That's a cargo carrying aircraft, not a bomber. What could you realistically do with 1920 and planes in South Africa? Just patrolling the close area equivalent to London to Berlin range. It's not exactly a close distance. So France. Okay. France. The mistake is the treaty. The mistake is the absolute treaty in the first place, because you agreed to be limited to the same strength as the Italians. And as I've been over several times in other videos recently, this basically means that you are schnookered. You are schnookered. Because you cannot both defend against the Italians in the Mediterranean if the Italians are your threat, and the Franco-Italian operator. One of the things that comes up, people go, well, the French are agreeing to the parity, like the British agreed to parity with the Americans. It's just the same consideration. No, it's not. For the British, two reasons. One, the Anglo-American relationship is nowhere near the Franco-Italian relationship in the 1920s. Nowhere near. At no point is the Anglo-American relationship anywhere close to how frosty and permanently threatening each other the Franco-Italian relationship is. Let's put it this way. The Anglo-American relationship is, they are always talking to each other, and they're usually talking quite well, and they usually have multiple negotiations going on sometimes, and they often have very nice parties and things going on, and all sorts of visits. The Franco-Italian Franco-Italian relationship is nowhere near that. Secondly, the British bank on and are proved correct of one judgment which goes into their naval treaties thing, that no matter what they agree, the United States Congress and the House of Representatives, i.e. the Senate and the House of Representatives, the United States Congress as a whole, will never pay for it. They are tightwads when it comes to naval spending. They won't fund it. So the Royal Navy goes, we'll agree to them being in principle given the same tonnage as us. They won't pay for it. And guess what? The Royal Navy is proved correct. At no point in the 1920s and 30s does the US Navy equal the Royal Navy in strength. At no point, because Congress don't pay for it. It's not the US Navy's fault, it's not the US as a country's fault, it's your government won't pay for it. They just simply will keep finding reasons to not spend the money on it. So it is not the same as the Franco-Italian relationship at all. Then you have the other scenario. So, the problem that often people point out to is, well, hang on, Britain's agreeing to parity with America when America can really focus in on the Pacific, because they basically have two oceans they have to worry about, the Atlantic and the Pacific. And the British, who they have a fairly decent relationship, are the big power in the Atlantic, other big power in the Atlantic, and if anyone's trying to get to America, they'll probably be pissing off the British as well at the same time, so, excuse the French there, so they'll probably have to get past the British. So you can afford, in many ways, to ignore the Atlantic, or at least have minimal forces there, and concentrate on the Pacific. Whereas, if you're the British, you have to think about the Atlantic, the, well, North and South Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific. You have to have forces in all four. So that puts the British at a disadvantage to the Americans. One of the Washington Naval Treaty, remember, the British are allowed as many cruisers as they want. The British are allowed to have their dominions buy as many cruisers as they want. So frankly, for the British, this doesn't really factor in as a problem under the Washington Treaty if the British actually do carry out the cruiser construction they're supposed to do. And the same can be, so that doesn't have a problem. The trouble is, the French have the same issue as the British. They have an empire spread around the world and they need to have presence there. They have a problem though. They share the Mediterranean with the Italians, who at this point don't have Abyssinia. They don't really have an empire in most of Africa. They just have a little bit in North Africa. And so literally that's Mediterranean coast, and all the Italians can afford to concentrate everything in the Mediterranean. So you can go, well, Alex, the French can build cruisers. They could build cruisers, but getting to actually build cruisers is an interesting thing, and that's a mistake they don't do. But the trouble is, the Italians, unlike the Americans, who the British counterparts are, can concentrate. The Americans can't. Because if the Americans attack the Brits, the Americans have the real possibility that the Japanese would attack them from the other side, because the Japanese just don't like the Americans because of, well, various parts of their history, and America and Japan having an interesting... Ah, that's where you are. Sorry. Doing some AA work. Got it, I think. Got it. Anti-aircraft mosquito working. But anyway, as the sort of the Americans could concentrate, but neither them or the British could really concentrate to fight the other. They'd have to spread out because they got so much to defend. Whereas the Italians can concentrate, so the French have to concentrate, and the French have to deal with the fact that their threat to their Far Eastern Empire is the Japanese. If they move ships to the Far East to defend that, which the Dutch were also considering building ships for to do so, then they don't have the ships in the Mediterranean. If they have the ships in the Mediterranean, they don't have the vessels in the Far East. The entire treaty system for the French, the way it's structured, destroys them as a strategically independent nation. Basically, this treaty means that from this point onwards, they are stuck to Britain. Why? Because their global security depends on Britain. Their ability to beat the Italians, well, it's the Royal Navy which will provide the extra ships. Their ability to ignore their northern coast if there's any German or Russian or Soviet, well, Russian, well, Soviet at this time, of course, activity, that's the Royal Navy. The Far Eastern, well, if they need support out there, it's going to be the Royal Navy who are going to get there first. and they will go with them. And it's going to be the Royal Navy presence in the Mediterranean which is going to help them balance the Italians while they're away. From this point onwards, the French basically become as tied to Britain in naval terms as any of the Dominions. And so people have often gone, so what's the advantages of the treaty for Britain, to an extent? Well, if you're playing chess in this scenario, you could say you lose the Anglo-Japanese alliance, or rather you have a very good excuse to get out of the Anglo-Japanese alliance when the Japanese are starting to cause you issues, without being able to, for it to be blamed on you, with it being another thing blamed on America. Should you need the Japanese in the future to balance on America, you've now got another thing for reasons for them to side with you, if you're thinking about putting that card in your pocket. But you've also got the scenario come through that France, they're now tied to Britain for their empire protection, for everything. So Britain's lost a potential threat and gained more ships. I could argue this is also something which the Americans haven't considered. Unless the Americans are planning on allying with the Italians, who they also don't really like. But well, they'll get on one side, especially once Mussolini comes to power. The Americans really don't like them. But France basically mucks up the Washington Naval Treaty and it destroys them. Their strategic independence. It's one of the reasons why they end up focusing in so much, I swear, on the various defensive positions is because of this. But the thing is, the French governments undermine themselves consistently on a strategic and military level in the 1920s and 30s. We cannot overstate how much the seeds of 1940 of the complete disruption and disintegration to extent of the French government and French forces have their history and roots in World War One, but also in the political situation they find themselves in post World War One, and the way their governments keep churning through, and the lack of a strategic direction. It's a constant problem. If the French had asked for more tonnage than the Italians would then put a position for the same tonnage as the French. Well, you see, that's another thing. We're all discussing this, but the French could have maybe got that through as allowing in the Francisco Caracolas. But also, it would be potentially the French could make the case for needing a distant water squadron. There are all sorts of options. You could argue they could have invested in cruisers. They could have invested in a lot of cruisers. And they could have under this system. But they would needed to invest in a lot of cruisers. Does that annoy the British having to pay for the French, or do they find the ability of being able to effectively control French maritime policy amusing? It's useful. And it's being very cynical when you put it that way. But have a think about it. Think about it in reality. Who is at that point is the guarantor of French security? In terms of their empire, when they cannot... If they take ships from the Mediterranean to go secure their empire, who are they relying on to fill the gap? So they can only do that if the British let them. Jack Ray, was the French government even less motivated to build ships than the US Congress? Yes. The French government were even less motivated. There is an entire thing that... One of the fun things is when you get into the Dunkirks and you realise their response to Italian cruisers, and you sit there and go, You're building battleships, and you're using battleship tonnage to build to replace to take out Italian cruisers. Why are you building using battleship tonnage to do that? That's what your cruiser tonnage is for. Why? One of the interesting things is the French actually eventually get around to investing in defense, but by the time they're doing so, it's the Alsace class they're talking about. That's the real problem. Same like, I see the French problem is manpower. That is an issue, yes, but there are ways of getting around that. Again, you could go for colonial employment. You could go for a French naval legion. I like the foreign legion approach. You could have, the French have options within their strategic system to do that. If you think about the sheer number of German naval officers, naval personnel, etc., wandering around looking for a job post-World War I, if you look at the sheer number of Russian ones who are looking for work in this period, the French could have set up a French naval foreign legion quite effectively. And they already have the modus operandi. Yes, they might not want to give them their battleships. They might not want to have that, but there are things they could have given them. France still has one of the largest Pacific real estates to this day. France making the case to be more than a Med Channel force would not at all be an unreasonable argument. I would say this treaty makes them a Mediterranean force. Churchill was suggesting they combine for the period of the war because he thought that was the only way to keep the French government going. Honestly, he saw the French government collapsing and he thought, well, we'd combine and therefore we would work together. And that would stop France falling. Unfortunately, the French government was already beyond that point. Take care, Amelia. Was there not also an issue with most of those that would have made up the continuation of the political class have been killed during World War I? Certainly a lot of them. So India. Again, it's the cruisers and the sloops. But what is it for India? Well, for India, they have an interesting scenario. They again have some great infrastructure they could invest in and develop. And they could have actually probably built their own county-class cruisers if they'd been investing in development. And building their own industry, having their own cruisers going around the world would have been a great way of growing themselves even while they were still a dominion and under an interesting, considering the 1919 Government of India Act, an interesting ruling scenario. It would have also potentially provided a bit of a melting pot for the Indian population, well, especially the middle class, who would probably have gone into the Navy, to work together. Do I think it would have stopped some of the issues which happened with the independence of India and the separation? No. But it might have made it better. It might have made it. It might have minimized it. It might have not made it better. It might have eased it at the edges, because even 4 cruisers are not enough of a melting pot. But the thing is, for India having those cruisers, that would have been a great capability and a great status. And it would, again, this is one thing with the Dominion Cruiser Program, the Empire Cruiser Program, whatever you wish to call it, depends on the author, it seems. You would have had a massive advantage. For Britain. And for the Empire in terms of security. It would also, let's think about it honestly. Once you have that many heavy cruisers wandering around the world, you suddenly make things like the Graf Spee a very, very bad tactical option. If you're looking at it and going, the British Empire has 48 county-class cruisers. 48 of them sailing around the world, plus whatever Hawkins they have. Let's say they have 550,000 tons of heavy cruiser. What the British and Americans get each allocated in the London Treaty, because of they have the sheer number of counties, etc. they have. there is a problem for anyone to try and take that on. And at that point, the Japanese get 330,000 tons of heavy cruiser, 5-3, ratio, and the Italians and the French would get 165,000 tons of heavy cruiser allocated to them under the 5-3 1.5 ratio. They get a 1.75 actually, don't they? So 5, that's 110,000 plus 75, so 82.5, so 192,500 tons worth of heavy cruisers they get allocated. It's an interesting scenario. Now, why do I make the sloops as the mistake? Well, again, it's building up your own infrastructure. But it's a big mistake when you're a nation which is how most of its own internal infrastructure is focused on getting stuff from the inside to the outside, to the ports, and moving things by the sea. And this is an Indian government decision in terms of the government of India as in an Act of 1918. So you're looking at its British governors, okay? It is, but it's not British it's not the British government. It's the British governors, who often they make the policy and then the British government goes, well, you've listened to the locals, you've made a decision. India is dependent upon moving the goods around them by sea. They do build some sloops. They do not in any way, shape or form build enough. They do not build enough domestically. They do not build up their own infrastructure. And so this is one of the reasons why in World War II, they lose their merchant vessels which are going around the Indian Ocean and taking the supplies around India. A lot of them get lost disturbingly quickly to the forces of the Japanese, Italian and German submarines operating in that area, because they have them all operating out of Rangoon area. They have a combined. One of the only combined naval forces of the Axis put together in World War II are the U-boats, the Italian submarines and the Japanese submarines operating in this area. And the thing is, that's what contributes to a lot of the issues you have in India with the food supplies, etc. And from a logistical perspective. So if you'd had your own escorts domestically, you could have convoyed those vessels yourself, could have probably reduced their losses dramatically, would have made it far more difficult for the submarines, so it would cost enemy submarines. And that would alleviate some things, but also the thing is, if you're contributing escorts and you have the escorts running around, the important thing is they're going to get more kills of submarines earlier in the war. The larger number of sloops and escorts you have going around at the beginning of World War II, the more German submarines get lost when their numbers are smaller, the longer it takes for the Germans, Italians and Japanese to build up their submarine fleets when they get deployed, and the more likely it is their experienced submariners, the ones who've been training into warriors, get killed. If you look at what happens to the German native destroyer forces after Narvik, because they lose the heart of their destroyer fleet in Narvik, in those battles, they lose so many experienced officers, so many experienced NTOs, so many of their crews get overwhelmed by the sheer firepower and the psychology that comes after it. If you do that to the submarine force earlier enough in World War II, that has a massive impact. Now, yes, India has issues, but again, if you're investing in this construction from the 1920s onwards, a lot of those issues with infrastructure, steel production, etc., would have been solved. It's not like you're trying to do a crash program in 1940. You're doing the program in 1920. And they do build these vessels. They do have these sloops. The Royal Indian Navy does exist. The RIN is a very useful and very capable force in World War II. It's just incredibly small. They are very active. They are very brave. But the thing is, if you'd started building them up in the 20s, if you'd given them county-class cruisers as their headquarters, as their major ships, and you'd given them well, they bought county-class cruisers because they would have been charged, and they'd bought sloops and built up a sloop fleet, so they'd had a cruiser and sloop force. You would have been dealing with a very capable fleet in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Now, before people start going into the whole thing of could they build them, etc., infrastructure, it's worthwhile noting the Indians have dockyards in World War II which regularly service and maintain cruisers, they regularly service and maintain destroyers. They even at certain points have air battleships come in for quick repairs. They already have some of the infrastructure invested in some of the infrastructure there. There was actually Bombay dockyard of the Royal Navy existed from 1670 to 1949, and was a very important dockyard. It used to actually build ships of the line for the Royal Navy. I think at one point, I think it was that was the dockyard. There was definitely they constructed in Malabar teak, and at one point, there's the Duncan dock. There's all sorts of interesting things there. So this is not me talking out of my behind or something like that. This is me actually saying, look, there is some infrastructure there for them to develop on. That infrastructure is used throughout World War II. That's very useful infrastructure. So it would have been based on Bombay. Okay, any construction of county-class cruisers in India would have probably been done in Bombay, and they would have developed from there. But, yeah, it could have been done. And the thing is, in the Washington Treaty, that's when they're starting up, and that's what they could have done. The Indian Coast Guard is established a bit late, but the Indian Navy does, and that's one of the reasons is because the Indian Navy does the fisheries protection. So that's one reason the Coast Guard takes so long to be established. And the Indians do build sloops and cutters. They build them a bit late. There goes over. In the Navy, do you think some of those ships would defect to the Axis, like reverse French fleet? I doubt it. There is always usually talked about the various defections, etc., but the Indian Army was overwhelmingly massively loyal, if you consider the size of the Indian Army versus how many defect. And in terms of those defections, most of those defections are prisoners who are then basically get the option of going and fighting for their captors and decide to do so. They're not usually it's a different scenario. I don't think you would have the Indian Navy, and the Indian Navy through World War II proves incredibly loyal and doesn't do anything like that, and I don't think they would have done. If India is building cruisers, could that experience help them with crash building light cruisers, aircraft carriers? There is certainly the case that if you have got India building cruisers, that yard might end up being able to build light fleet carriers. And Rapper Roseback are Commonwealth countries now. They are part of the British limit. But remember, it is the British Empire Agreement, and this is part of the Washington Treaty. They are signed into sort of part of limits, but remember, this is under the Washington Treaty. The cruisers are definitely under the Washington Treaty. The sloops carry under on London as well. The Washington Treaty doesn't have a surface ceiling on the number of ship cruisers you can build. They're not allowed to displace more than 10,000 tons in standard, but you can build as many cruisers and many ships under that limit as you want. You've got limitations on how many capital ships you can build. You've got limitations on how many aircraft carriers you can build. You've got no limitations on the quantity of anything else under the Washington Treaty. Pardon me. There goes either. If there's an Indian Navy, the East Africa theatre would be over much quicker. It would be. So, whilst, yes, they're subject... And this is the thing, again, why I would then go into the sloops. Because sloops you're able to produce as many of those as you like after the London Treaty. And you could have produced as many as you liked and prior to the London Treaty. And again, if you're building sloops and you're building cruisers... Well, sloops, and if they're turbine-powered, etc., they're basically all the ingredients for a destroyer, barring the torpedoes. You can soon shift to destroyer production if you want to, once the treaty's over. Or once you decide to suspend the treaty, because it's no point anymore. And if you're building sloops and cruisers, you could have kept that yard going quite nicely, quite happily. And the Indians could have had a very, very strong, capable fleet for their exact force. No, Aaron, there's no worry about it. Haven't seen you ranting in the chat. I've seen you being upset about the Dutch, but that's about it. British India is an interesting scenario. It's not necessarily... I wouldn't say the Brits destroyed the Indian industry. I would say it's one of the interesting things is the British government wants to actually enhance and accelerate British Indian industry. But the governors, for some reason, do some very weird decisions. And there's a lot of pork barrel politics, to use that phrase. And I hope that... don't mean that in any offensive way. Before someone who's from India is coming and going, that's... well, not India, but probably from Pakistan, is commenting that's being... It's not. It's basically... they were trying to give out contracts in a way which gave people, certain friends, more money than others, than people who they didn't like, and it caused huge amounts of disruption. Basically, British India goes for a period in the 1920s which is incredibly... there are incredibly interesting issues. It gets mostly fixed by the 1930s, but they don't spend a lot of time dealing with the issues. And that means they're very internalized and they're looking at it. Everyone, has any image of the Commonwealth navies which can't build counties building a proto-tribal swarmers? There aren't any limits on that under Washington either. Indian cruisers and destroyers joining 4C. Well, that is the point you would probably have with this larger force. You might well have Indian, South African, Australian, New Zealand vessels joining 4C. You might even have an aircraft carrier or two joining. Because again, think about it from the point of view of the sheer number of extra escorts you'd have, how that would free up. Because if you don't have the... when you don't have the Indian Navy vessels out there, or the or South African, etc., where are those vessels coming from? The vessels coming up from the Royal Navy's own numbers. So if the Royal Navy doesn't have to have as many ships out in those areas, they have those ships, they have those ships in the war zones, or where they need them. So you might not lose as many other ships because you have more escorts. India in 1949 is not India in 1941 or even 1955. I can't see a scenario where Indian ships pull a Khomeini in World War II. No. That's interesting. Are sloops governed by speed? Sloops are supposedly limited to 20 knots. They cannot be designed to be greater than 20 knots. They can't be designed. The fact that most of them could do greater than 20 knots quite happily is neither here nor there. And they were given turbines. They weren't designed for greater than 20 knots, Stephen Richards. That's the criteria. They couldn't be designed. If they achieved greater than 20 knots, oh, that's just terrible. But they weren't designed to be greater than faster than 20 knots. Dear Guy, when you say these cruisers could be built in minutes, you mean just the hulls and engines, with engines and guns built in the UK? No, in the case of Canada, India, and Australia, they could build a lot. If you went to around Cockatoo Island, where we went around in Sydney, and you see the sheer amount of plant and facility they have there to construct, they can build their own. They could build their own turbines. They could build their own things there. They could have built them. Possibly not the 8-inch guns. Possibly those would have all come from the UK, but pretty much everything else would have been built in the country. Now, if the Indians are building sloops and guns on them, they would have provided a base to build field artillery for the expanded army in order to alleviate some of the shortages. It would have certainly made interesting. So they were trying to undo the deindustrialization that had been done in the 19th century. To be honest, some of the comments about deindustrialization in the 19th century are overblown. It's more a case of its concentration of the industrial capacity. It's okay. So you have some of the issues are India are a bad management of market forces, and that's not the topic of this video, so I don't want to get involved in it. But some of it is not an actual policy; it's just a not understanding of what the economic effects of policy or some of the policies will be. But that's not really my area of expertise. It's for me to explain it properly, I would have to get a friend of mine on. But I'm not sure when he's next back from Sri Lanka. So I would have to discuss that if I could get him. Or maybe I'll get him to just write something or record something. Well, sloops wouldn't have an impact on capital ships. In the nicest way, a 4-inch sloop is not going to have any 4-inch gun-armed sloop is not going to have an impact on a capital ship. That's just wiped out. In the nicest way, you stick one battleship, even World War I vintage battleship, in the middle of a load of sloops, they're all sunk. It's their anti-submarine warfare and convoy escorts. Surface raiders, as in converted merchant ships, could also have an interesting tandem. Sloops. The reason this is one of the reasons why sloops are a mistake rather than a missed opportunity, because sloops you can build anything under 10,000 tons, including sloops. And sloops had been defined because the Royal Navy had been operating sloops in World War I. The Flower class were sloops in World War I. They were Flower class sloops. So sloops are defined by the time of the Washington Treaty. They're just not under the limit, and they're not specified on the limits. And then by the Article 8 of the London Treaty, they are part of there. And the fact is, you could have continued that program on. So you could have started this program under the Washington Treaty, and you could have kept it going. IO2. Indian-built counties with 666. Why would you build something with 666-inch guns in the 1920s? When there's no limit on the number of 8-inch gun cruisers you could build. And when the 666 is, whilst it's on HMS, one of the E-class, I think it's Enterprise, it's a twin 6. There's no 666 turrets wandering around the 1920s. Sorry, IO2. It's an interesting idea, yes, but you wouldn't do that. You build town class, and that will be built in the 1930s, not 1920s. So then we got to Japan. And, well, the mistake. There is a big mistake. The Imagi was damaged by an earthquake, and so they couldn't use that. And so they decide to build the Kaga. Now, the thing is, they don't have to pick the Kaga. There is often this idea that you have to do 2 conversions. But if you consider the British do not do 2 conversions of that tonnage, or the British don't, to get the maximum tonnage. The British don't at all. They don't go into that. They go to that level at all to go that way. The Japanese don't have to either. The Japanese could have built a new ship. They had the option of converting to, but they could have gone, if they decided that there was really nothing better than the Kaga, they could have built a new ship from the ground up, and they could have actually not had an aircraft carrier which was so slow it actually limited the maneuverability and range and operational speed of their carrier task forces. It just, no. The Kaga is just a mistake. Okay? It just is. But then we have the Megami-class cruisers, and this is the big problem for the Japanese, because once you decide you are going to completely ignore the treaties and get around them by designing your ships to be rapidly upgraded to something else, the question becomes, why the frigate do you not do that for every ship? In a nicest way, if you have decided that the treaties have completely mucked you over, and you can argue with the Japanese that they have, if you decided that, then why not if you're going to cheat properly? The example I would give is submarines. They could have built a whole host of them. And how would anyone have known? How would anyone have known? Because let's be honest, it's not like Germany or Italy or France or even Britain and America, where frankly it's fairly easy for most of the treaty members to have someone wander around and check on yards discreetly, because let's be honest, you can usually find people who look suitable or who have suitable skills to do that. Japan, those people will stick out like, well, the sore thumb, to be perfectly honest. But also, Japan has different infrastructure things, different scenarios of moving around Japan in the 20s and 30s. It's not very easy for foreigners or anyone to really get around Japan in this time period. And if you built, let's say, a big warehouse next to a dock, big warehouse, wouldn't look out of place. And if that dock appeared to have a concrete wall around it, so that was the concrete side, no one would think. No one would think that maybe below the waterline and below the tile range, there is a big hole in the concrete which a submarine can go through underwater, then pop up inside, and it's in a nice U-boat pen, well, a nice submarine pen, to be serviced and maintained. You can also have the fact that submarines have numbers, and you can keep changing numbers and moving them around instead of names, and you can make it very difficult for anyone to know how many submarines you have. For the Japanese, having more submarines would have been quite possible. Also, the Japanese, unlike a lot of those other nations, do build a lot of the stuff themselves. And whilst, yes, you can have a rough idea of how much the components going in are going out on other things, you have problems with it. In terms of, that's never accurate, and you can just claim you're building more merchant ships, or you can claim merchant ships require more than they actually do, or other ships require more, or you can claim you have a failure rate. That's actually one of the interesting examples to give off if you want to think about it as an idea or an option, especially when you're doing certain computer games where you have to talk and explain, or computer games or various board games where you have to explain your stats. You can claim a high failure rate of your engine. You can if you're prepared to accept, for the advantage of having more systems, more equipment available than the opponent knows, you are able to accept the idea that they will make you think worse of you than you actually are by telling them that you're less able to, the engines you produce are not always reliable, and therefore you have a high engine failure rate. You can get away with that. You can say that helps you on two levels, because it makes them think you're less capable than you are, so they're not as threatened by your existing systems, and you can say it allows you to build up more of those systems. But the combined British Empire building program of submarine sloops will be improved yards, local economy, and submarine infrastructure. SteveClarke, Alex, others have highlighting the issues with infrastructure in the minute, but is that not a mistake? There's a possibility of 15,000 tons of vessels compared to building that not more of a mistake than the possibility of building 10,000 tons of vessels compared to building the county. I'm not sure what you're saying, Steve, but here's one of the things. The treaties do not restrict you from building the infrastructure. Okay? The British government could still invested in the infrastructure in the treaty system. They could have still invested. There is no limitations within the treaty which stops Britain and the Dominions investing in infrastructure. So they could have built up yards that were more capable. They could have built up all these things while not building ships. They could have done. They wouldn't without building the ships, but they could have done. So the thing is, if we go back to the criteria again at the beginning, it has to be attributable to the treaties, not the 10-year rule, not the economic downturn to the Washington Naval Treaty, all those things. Downturn, it has to be the Washington Naval Treaty. And so the infrastructure you can't put down to the Washington Naval Treaty, because the governments could choose to invest in infrastructure when they didn't need to. If you consider the British had traditionally been on a 6-year cycle of investing and growing their infrastructure, that had been prior to the Anglo-German naval race or any of the dreadnought races with all the other powers, that have been prior to treaty system that have been ongoing. There is nothing stopping them or preventing them investing in infrastructure. So that is not the lack of investment in infrastructure in terms of growing, of increasing and maintaining naval capacity is not down to the Washington treaties. It's down to governments. I too. Japan could try to argue that Margie's destruction of the earthquake was impossible to foresee and that she'd get to build a replacement slightly higher than normal tonnage allocation. They could do. And as Carl also no limitation on naval-sponsored fishing vessels. Yes, the Royal Navy built a lot of trawlers at various points. So yeah, you're building. Yeah, Steve, I'm still trying to figure out your last comment on it. It's not making sense because as it literally reads to me is Alex Awazar highlight the issues with infrastructure in the Dominions of territories. Is this not more of a mistake than that's the possibility of 15,000 tons of vessels compared to building counties? I think I've answered that with my infrastructure answer. I hope that was the answer, but I'm not sure because I'm not sure of that question. Okay, New Zealand. Well, there is no chance of New Zealand being upgrading their stuff to build counties, but the thing is, procuring the counties from Britain could have been quite useful for a different reason. New Zealand had issues in this period with they wanted immigration. They wanted skilled people to be immigrating. They wanted a lot of growth, and they wanted to grow their population. With the Geeds Acts falling in the 1920s, and if they'd been building counties, they could, of course, turned around to the people leaving the Royal Navy and employed them. And the same with the Australians and South Africans, etc. And that would have formed an instantaneous ability to grow their navies. But also to grow immigration. Because a lot of the people who would join the ships would come with families, especially the senior NCOs and the senior officers. And that'd be useful. That gets you a large group of technical people emigrating to your country. That's helpful. I think like Alex, I'm sorry. No, please don't apologize. I'm hoping I got your question right. So it's not you, it's me worrying that I haven't got the question right. The treaties only limit fortifications. Geoguy, actually, that's again a mistake. Not a mistake, but a misunderstanding that's quite common, is that the treaties limit fortifications in certain areas, mainly in the Pacific. The British can fortify things in the Atlantic as much as they like. They can fortify things in Australia as happily as they like. They can fortify Singapore. They can fortify... They can't... Hong Kong is an issue, but they do have some proviso around Hong Kong. But pretty much if they want to fortify India, they want to fortify anywhere else in the British Empire, they can fortify to their heart's content. So New Zealand, that would have been useful. But honestly, the sloop program, they could always have built those. And again, for New Zealand, they have a problem. They are entirely dependent on sea liner communications to go everywhere. They do not have a large population base. Their best security has always lied in their distance, their ability to do diplomacy, and their ability to be of enough use to larger powers that the larger powers come and defend them. This was the case in the Empire. This is the case to this day, to an extent. And if they get attacked by someone, basically, which they hope to avoid. Again, having sloops, having cruisers, and they do. And the New Zealand, this is the point about New Zealand and Australia. They're the ones who are closest to doing this. The Australians and New Zealanders both have cruiser forces. The Australians have their own navy throughout the interwar years. They don't invest in it. They have a few destroyers, a few submarines for a while, then they get rid of them. They have cruisers and they have some sloops, but they don't really invest in it properly in the interwar years when they can under the treaty system. And the New Zealanders, they try and build up, and they eventually do have their own New Zealand Navy very shortly before World War II. They have the capabilities. But the reason they're doing this is both of them know that their best way to get defense in terms of British Empire is to be contributors. Because if they're contributing something, they're part of it, and they have an influence over it, and they have a say. And both of them know they're dependent upon the sea for their defense and security, and for most of all, their ability to survive and trade and communicate with the rest of the outer world. So there's no infrastructure restrictions on infrastructure. Wouldn't someone eventually say, why do you need all these dry docks and slipways in these very interesting places? The British could just turn around and go, we need them for the Empire. We have to be able to move the fleet and operate the fleet anywhere to defend the Empire. That's it. You want to argue about that, that's fine. But at that point, we know we need this infrastructure. But the point is, as I've tried to make, is that the infrastructure is not the infrastructure construction is not limited by the treaties. The infrastructure, the lack of ship construction, which is excused in part by the treaties, but the treaties use a cover for, but there is no actual limit on the number of cruisers you can build under Washington Naval Treaty, is used to explain the lack of investment in infrastructure. But the treaty doesn't limit infrastructure, and it doesn't limit the number of cruisers you can build, or the number of sloops you can build, or the number of destroyers you can build, really, or anything under 10,000 tons. So, in the nicest way, or submarines, the treaty's not at fault here. These are opportunities which the treaty had as included in them, which they didn't go for. Brad S. For India, the critical infrastructure and good transport question is how to carry goods between their east and west coasts, and India could build merchant ships, production or internal railways, preferably both. Preferably both, yes. They do have a railway, but it's a single track one, if I remember correctly. And please note, we are talking about Britain, which, as we all know, magically has a whole load of exact 4-inch armour plates which exactly fit its county-class cruisers. Goodness knows what they'd have had if they'd been building more of them. The defense of the Empire is a bit like NATO. The more you contribute on more strategic location, the more the central powers will listen to you. I.e., the major powers will listen to you. That makes sense. If all the Dominions could decide to say build or buy a bunch of 15-inch, even 16-inch naval guns for the coast defense, could they be reused for battleship construction? Well, the barrels certainly could. If you bought a full naval turret and you just slotted it into a land position, that might be more interesting, but you could do that. Then no one could really argue about it. You could just say, we're just implementing. So if let's put it this way. If you built Nelson and Rodney, and then you built a whole load of extra gun turrets and put them all over the world, as into, i.e. defending Singapore, etc. Instead of using 15-inch guns, you put, I don't know, six triple turrets. Well, A, you'd have a huge amount of firepower sitting at Singapore. Goodness gracious me. I hope you had a load of high explosive as well, shells, because that would just decimate anyone attacking Singapore. Yeah. But they didn't want to pay for that. In a nice way, getting the government to pay for the defense of Singapore was like trying to milk a stone. It's just not going to happen. So America. Well, America, I'm going to admit, has 2 slides, because frankly, trying to get it all into one slide was fricking impossible. Both the mistake and the missed opportunity. Cruisers. 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 Lord help us all, cruisers. The American Navy has issues. The example I give is the Pensacola class, which are the first of the big 8-inch cruisers, gun gear cruisers they built. The Pensacola is laid down in 1926, launched in 1929, commissioned 1930. Salt Lake City, laid down 1977, launched 1929, commissioned 1929. The treaty's 1922. It takes 4 years! 4 years for them to get round to actually building cruisers. And when they do, let's be honest, it takes the most of 4 years to get 2 of them into service. 2. So basically 8 years. There's a whole new treaty come in and they've just entered service. There is a reason the US ends up doing what they do, the Lexington class, with those 8-inch guns. It's because they have a lack of cruisers, and so they need those 8-inch guns, apparently, to defend themselves. Something you never want an aircraft carrier actually to do. Something which causes tremendous trouble with their weight, displacement, all that ammunition, all those things, everything as high up in the ship as it is. And the fact you don't want a aircraft carrier actually engaging in a fight with a enemy cruiser. Leaving all that to one side, that's all because the Americans do not build enough cruisers themselves. And there is no limitation on it. This is the thing the Royal Navy was banking on. That if in doubt, the US government would not build the ships they needed. They wouldn't fund it. And this is a problem for the US Navy, because if they want to grow their ability to deter conflict, they need presence around the world. If you can't build capital ships, which they've been relying on, if you can't build the battle cruisers, which were going to be the core of your scouting force, the core of your fleet for rapid reaction world events, if you cannot build enough ships to build up your infrastructure and maintain your infrastructure, then you are going to not look strong. You are going to look weak. The US Navy could have built cruisers. We cannot turn around and go, I know this is one of the troubles. A lot of people look at the very relative positions financially today of America and Britain, and they go, well, Britain's not as rich as it used to be. Britain's richer than it used to be. It's just not the rich. It's not the same level of the rich table, because other countries have got richer more quickly than Britain. But it still used to be one of the richest nations in the world. It still is one of the richest nations in the world. It could afford it. America could afford it then, and it could afford it now. It's not. It's not. Some of the perceptions people have are entirely skewed off. People think because a country isn't the richest or one of the top 3 richest countries in the world anymore, they're now poor. They're not. They're not poor. They still have a lot of money. And America needed cruisers. They needed cruisers for their task forces. They needed cruisers for their scouting force. They needed cruisers. They didn't have enough cruisers. They hadn't been building enough cruisers ever. The Americans had concentrated on capital ships. In many ways, they are just as misshapen as the Germans were in World War I, because the Germans had the capital ships, i.e. the battleships and battlecruisers, then they had a dearth of vessels in between, and then they had the torpedo boat, aka their equivalent of destroyers. The Americans are the same. They have the amazing 4-stackers destroyers. Tons of them. They have some excellent capital ships, excellent battleships, excellent designs coming through. And then they have the Brooklyn class, or nothing, arguably, in terms of the cruisers. And this is a navy which had won the Spanish-American War, arguably on the strength of their cruisers. The Battle of the Philippines, and all the sort of ones in Manila, etc. Those are cruisers which win those battles. It's American cruisers which have won their naval wars, and yet it's American cruisers which have not been built. And it's American cruisers which are not being constructed when the treaty system has been set up to allow people to construct as many cruisers as they want. Because the idea was to stop a capital ship race. But cruisers were considered necessary for your presence, for your status, for your capability to do anything in the world in peacetime. Right, so let's answer some questions. So you're like, UK's 1930s political issues. Modern politicians is polite. Yeah. I always wonder why the US did not try to build an Omaha derivative with 4 of those twin turrets instead of casemates. Honestly, there's lots of issues with the US Navy in terms of their designs and cruisers. I did a whole series on the US Navy's treaty cruisers, and I loved doing that series, but I did find it very disheartening looking at what happened to the US Navy. There were so many issues. Almost the US scaring the British and Japanese by actually building cruisers would have been aside. It would have been really interesting. The British, the volume of construction you could have seen on cruisers would have been absolutely interesting. I don't think they would have scared the British. The British would have just gone, oh, great. And the British would probably persuade, in the nicest way, the Americans actually building cruisers would have probably caused the British to actually get the Empire county program. But just then think about that scenario of the world with the British and Americans having that many cruisers in service, and what would have happened to the Japanese. The Japanese might have gone bankrupt with their 1920s cruiser program. Leaving that to one side, though. But, you know, it would change the scenario for the Germans especially. If there are enough cruisers from the Americans and the Brits going around the world, as that scenario would create, then, frankly, the Americans are going to have problems. Not the Americans, the Germans are going to have problems, because the Deutschland class are just not going to be in anything. If the British Empire and the Americans both are mounting roughly 40 heavy cruisers with 8-inch guns, then that's a lot of presence around the world that they might bump into. I wouldn't. It's honestly, it falls between the gaps between Congress and Senate, between Senate and the House of Representatives, i.e., the two houses of Congress. It's fun. They went capital ships plus scout crews with no sea control, and amazing how much effort they spend on a fighting cruiser force in the 30s. Yeah. Have you done Canada yet? Yes, they were one of the first ones. Brett says the USN had more cruisers in the 1930s. They might have spent more time with torpedo practice and defected some defect. For that, they'd have to fit their cruisers with torpedoes. They did in some cases, but they didn't in others. The Americans are interesting with their cruisers. They might have actually added some, may have ended up going Aztec or, well, sonar on theirs. UK cruisers were... He said it would have been better if the UK government stopped being cheap. The counties aren't cheap. I would say York and Exeter's, the cut price counties, are a good example of them mucking around, but the previous counties are fairly good. And I would say the Didos are war emergency. The Arafusers are actually fairly useful. The shift to light cruisers are not because of cheapness. But we haven't got onto Britain. We will be getting onto Britain shortly. But there is another missed opportunity, and that is one I think worthwhile saying, because this is why I've categorized this as a missed opportunity. Okay, it's not a mistake, but it is a missed opportunity. It is another route, another gone. You have to remember what they made the actual decision to gut their scouting force in favor of their battle fleet, because they chose to complete 2 Colorados instead of 2 Lexington battlecruisers. They could have not built those and have built 2 of those and 2 of those. Now, this is a very good battleship. You will not get me arguing that. But considering what we know about World War II, this would have been a very interesting scenario for the Americans to end up in. 2 Lexington-class aircraft carriers and 2 Lexington-class battle cruisers. And also, think about this. Under that scenario, if they have a battle cruiser and air carrier hybrid for their scouting forces, their scouting forces, each one is set around 2 such task forces, this probably doesn't need to have its 8-inch guns, because it's got one of these nearby. And the whole purpose of a Lexington class was to destroy cruisers. They were very good at that. That's what they're designed for. So no cruiser was going to be getting close to one of their aircraft carriers with them as their sister, protecting with their 16-inch guns. Secondly, you then have a very different scouting force capability and presence, speed or operations. You have all those advantages for World War II. But probably most importantly is, think about this. What would a modernized Lexington have been like by the time of 1941? Because you can guarantee they would have been some of the first ships modernized. Now, they also would have had an interesting effect on both Japan and Britain. Because one of the other advantages the British were banking on was that their battle fleet was actually faster as a whole than the American battle fleet. And the Japanese banked on this tremendously as well. With Lexington's around, no longer do you have a guaranteed faster. This is going to have an impact on your decisions and on your deployments. And again, if the Americans are building Lexingtons, how's it going to impact on various things? In terms of the British procurement, i.e. the nail rods. So, it's an interesting idea to consider. It's not this is a missed opportunity because neither route is necessarily bad. Both have negatives going either way. Both have positives. The Americans go this way and they go down, they have the battleships. They go this way, they have the fast task forces. It's an interesting scenario to be thinking about. More USN Iron Cruisers, not so great, equals not so great depression. The failed painter never gets to power, maybe? I doubt that, but it would be an interesting... It would make a lot of calculations. One of the things you have to remember is that because of the treaties, etc., and a willingness not to an unwillingness to invest in defence wholly, including the 10-year rule in Britain, affecting not just the navy, you have a perception, especially amongst those dictators in the world, that the Western powers are not prepared to defend themselves and are not prepared to fight another war. They don't want. They are too averse of war fighting. If they'd actually built more ships, you could argue that A, their economies and infrastructure would be stronger, but B, they could also have deterred conflict better because they would have shown they were more willing to build weapons of war and actually more capable. You'd also raised the bar they need, because let's be honest, there's the Deutschland class might work as surface raiders in a world where you have 16 roughly counties wandering around. In a world where you have 40 counties wandering around, they don't work. You have 2.5 times. If they were in a world where 48 counties were going, three times as many counties are wandering around, that becomes a very big issue. Because if you consider, let's say, Cumberland, if you double the number of counties there, or you double the number of counties involved in the Battle of the River Plate. So it's not Exeter; it's two full-size counties with 8 guns each, and 2 light cruisers. That's gonna cause trouble for the Graf Spee. That's gonna sink her. And then you've got all the extra cruisers wandering around for Scharnhorst and Gneisenau when they're wandering around, or even Bismarck when it comes out, or, etc. Instead of it having 2 cruisers shadowing it, might have 4 cruisers shadowing it. And that might change all sorts of things. Deutschland might not get away. The German infrastructure will be left the same because of the Treaty of Versailles, and maybe they get the naval treaty, but they're still not going to be able to build their infrastructure up that much faster. So their level to build up to actually be a viable fleet to fight the British is going to be a long way away. Building even a handful of Armada derivatives follow-ons might result in the US retaining torpedoes on their light cruisers, which might butterfly into the Mark 14 when fixed earlier. You could always hope. Going on, 40 8-inch gun cruisers would have proved problematic for the Italians once they had their World War II air refits. North America and Africa would have been an interesting place, as the main transport route is within 8-inch fire gun range for a bit. Yeah, it would have been interesting. Shark, to be fair, I'm of the opinion the Lexington design needs some refinement, so it doesn't need to go 35 knots. 32 or 33 or 32 is more than enough, sufficient. Potentially, but we'll see. Sure, the Atlantis bought the torpedoes to the USN's light cruisers because they were meant to be leading destroyer groups. Yeah. SteveClarke, the initial failure of the treaties from the interwar to everyone is the cost of a naval experience in shipbuilding. Yes. But the thing is that the decision not to build is not the treaty's fault. These are mistakes or missed opportunities by governments under the treaties. So basically, under the treaty system, they could have built this. The Americans could have built the Lexingtons and the sort of 2-2 and built instead of building the Colorados. You can argue either way, and you can make a very good argument for why to build the Colorados. I'm not saying it was a wrong decision. Please note, I'm going to underscore this before I get a dozen commenters going, no, you should have... The battle cruiser is not... Lexington's nowhere near as good as the Colorado. I can understand why you would say that. Now, certainly as an individual ship basis, I would agree. But in terms of a task force basis of what it would be in terms of its cumulative value, I would say actually the Lexington battlecruiser carrier combo, the 2 pairs of them, are more useful than the 2 Colorados. If those crews are hanging out, I doubt Britain loses. It would be glorious, as she'll have an escort that can let her run away or evict her renown in before they find her. They'll have a bit of. Let's be honest, you'd have enough cruisers wandering around that Sharnos and Eisenhower probably would be having a nightmare time. Thank you, 9684. I did know, but thank you for telling me. So, yeah. It's a missed opportunity. It's something to consider. Australia. And thanks, Steve, as well. It's always I do get sometimes a bit distracted by the fact, I do admit this, by the different topics which appear in the chat and going, oh, that's interesting, that's cool. Oh, that's interesting, that's cool. And then sort of going, ooh, sugar. Yeah. Off topic. So, Australia. Australia is interesting because Australia actually does invest in these things more than anyone else. But they don't invest enough. They start off with a program to build 17 ships in the 1920s, and then they cancel it because of the economic downturn. And that causes issues, because that actually makes the economic downturn worse. Yes, you're saving the government money and stopping government spending, but that government spending would have actually propped up quite a large section of the economy and would have, as I've talked about before, Keynesian economics. It would have fed through. The interesting thing I find with Keynesian economics is it often gets turned around into, these days, into the idea of trickle-down economics, where you give very rich people massive tax cuts and hope it triples down the economy. The trouble is, for a government, the problem with that is you can't control the investment. So they could choose to invest that money in a company based in your country, or they could choose to invest that money in a company based in another country. That is a problem. It's a hope and a wait and see. The advantage of defence spending is you get to choose where it goes. So if you invest in building this stuff in Australia, and Australia probably could, honestly, going around Cockatoo Island, etc., the amount of infrastructure they build up there in Sydney and all in various other parts of Australia, they could have built them. They built 2 in the UK in terms of county class cruisers. I think they could have. I think possibly they could have set a model of building 2 in the UK and then building some more in Australia. Whether they built 2 or whether they built more would be an interesting factor. Whether they, with sloops, they did build the Bathurst class. They built a huge amount of sloops in World War II. And they're a very capable design. They don't build Flower class corvettes. They build their own corvettes. Their own vessels. And they're very good ones. And they build River class frigates as well. And the thing is, the Australians actually invest to an extent in it. They just don't invest enough. And the reason Australia does invest is because they are even more exposed than New Zealand. In many ways, Australia is the shield of New Zealand. They are even more interdependent on global trade than New Zealand. And they are therefore even more dependent with their population strength, etc., and the fact of their infrastructure. There's sort of the great spaces in between their population centres in Australia, so they're not really mutually supporting. They're even more dependent upon being part of something larger than themselves to provide them with defence. If you look at Australia today, there's the AUKUS, but which they were real pushing behind. The Australian UK-US deal. There's also Australian involvement in Five Eyes. Australia is practically a member of NATO in so many ways. Especially if you look at their recent procurement of equipment and how much of that does slot into NATO equipment. But the thing is, more importantly about Australia, they've known this for a long time, and they've had a consistency of it. The trouble is, again, it's very easy for us to talk about this in hindsight. The development of infrastructure, etc., would have strengthened Australia. We know that in hindsight. We also know when World War II happens. We know that they haven't got peace. We know that World War I has not cured the world's ills of conflict. So we know this. So these are mistakes in hindsight, in a way. And judging them in hindsight. I can judge them as being the wrong decision at the time, but it is always to an extent in hindsight. And when I say this in hindsight, again, I refer you to the example at the beginning. Not going to a concert with a family, you miss out on the fun experience of spending time with your family and catching up on them, and, you know, those memories that do last a lifetime. It's a mistake, really, probably, to prioritize work at that time, but you need to sometimes prioritize work, and you'll make it up, hopefully. But it's a missed opportunity. I mean, but not going to America when I could, and getting to walk around US and New Jersey with my dad, that's a mistake. And I know about that because of what happens afterwards. It can look like another missed opportunity, but it is a mistake. And again, the sloops would have been something that they could have been building. And again, it's something which can build up your infrastructure industry. And they were already investing. This is the funny thing about Australia. They're investing in building up their infrastructure, building up their industry. They're putting in fortifications and defences around Australia. Yet they're not building ships. Not in the quantities they could be. Because, again, they let that program go in the 1920s. I think it was the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, wasn't it? I seem to remember it was CETO, not South Pacific Treaty Organization. Not sure, Steve. Might be wrong. You're more likely to get Congress authorizing 4 battle carriers and 2 battle cruisers and 2... They couldn't build battle carriers under the Washington Naval Treaty. That is one thing. You cannot build a battle carrier under the Washington Naval Treaty. A carrier is not able to carry the same gun... is not able to carry guns more than 8 inches under the Washington Naval Treaty, and... yeah. I too. That's a bit of an interesting timeline to try and think about, really. In terms of your question about Australia and New Zealand getting to retain their battlecruisers. New Zealand didn't technically own their battlecruiser. It was technically the Royal Navy. They contributed towards it, but they couldn't actually fund and maintain it and crew it. They didn't have the money, so the British had to do that. This is one of the reasons why I say smaller ships. Again, with New Zealand, I suspect they'd be able to do 2 counties. But if they did get to retain them, on the agreement that their replacements were no more than 20% heavier and had 12-inch guns, maybe recycled, it'll be interesting to see what their treaty replacement will be, whether they get their treaty replacement prior to 1930 or whether after 1930, and what conditions get added on then. Battle carriers are apparently causing Sean Mack physical pain, so we should probably stop discussing them, or at some point I should do a video about them, just so that, you know, we can have that post to him occasionally. I'm not cruel to my admins in any way, shape or form. Sub-Britain. Again, it's going to go back to the same mistake. And it's amazing how Britain and all these countries have the same mistake in the small escorts. And the thing is, The mistake comes from the idea that they will always have more time to mass produce the small escorts when needed. Britain has an ongoing program of producing small escorts, and yet they build them in batches of 2, of 3, of 4 every year or other year. And you just go, why? It's keeping our technology viable, and then we'll be able to surge build them when we need them. Yeah, hate to break this to you, but actually you should be building roughly 10 a year. It actually won't cost you much more than you're building your 3 or 4. Honestly, it wouldn't for Britain. But it will mean that by the time any war breaks out, they'll probably be less than 20 years. You'll probably not keep them more than 18, 20 years. Maybe keep them less than. It might keep them less than. It might be 15 years. But you will have about 150 to 200 in service or in reserve to call upon, and you won't need to do a crash build program. I don't. And they mention if Australia was building even 5 battle cruisers, that was something. I don't think Australia would build 5 battle cruisers. In a nice way, I've been talking about them. They can build cruisers. They've built light cruisers. They can upgrade their infrastructure to build full county class cruisers quite with the amount of investment they're already making. Battle cruisers are a completely different rule of the thumb in terms of size. Now, then we have the missed opportunity. So, we have the Naval there. The Naval is a very well armored battleship. It's got massively thick armor, and it's got 9 16-inch guns. It's a very capable ship, and looking at their performance in World War II, no one can really argue that Nelson and Rodney were not good ships for what they wanted to do. However, the other option considered, strongly considered, was the F3, which was, we will loosely term a battle cruiser, but it had battleship in terms of spread of armor, 10 inches thick, but I'll get into that, and had a speed of roughly at least 28 knots, and was armed with 15-inch 50s. Now here is the thing: it would have displaced, whereas these displaced 33,500 tons in standard, this would probably have displaced 34,000 tons in standard, considering the same margin of error as occurred in these. So you would have had 1,000 more tons if you wanted to hang on extra armor on them, which could well have made it to 14 inches over magazines and engine rooms if you wanted to. Or at least, if you made it slightly larger, you could probably make it, carrying more area, you'd probably make it up to 12 inches of armor. Now, the big interesting difference is, A, that would give you 2 more fast ships, and might then have a long-term increase in the terms of your speed of your Queen Elizabeth class, because if these are doing 28 knots, then you might well upgrade your Queen Elizabeth with small true boilers to get them to 28 knots. And at that point, you have those going far. You have enough fast ships that probably this has an impact on how Renown, Repulse, and Hood are used in World War II, but also on the reality of the deployments of Hood and King and Prince of Wales and all those things, and the various operations that go on if you've got more fast ships is amazing. But the biggest impact and biggest role and consequence is that 15-inch 50 gun. Because if you have 15-inch 50s on these, then part of the upgrade you're going to have of every single ship that the Royal Navy has going through its upgrade program is going to be 15-inch 50s. So you end up with a standardized 15-inch 50 fleet. The odds are then King George V's turn into 9 15-inch 50 ships as well, because it's the standard gun for the British, and why would we be going down to drop down to 14-inch? Dropping down to 14-inch from 16-inch makes a statement. From 15-inch to 14-inch just looks sad. And 9 15-inch 50s is a fairly decent firepower. That also means you might not have the same issues with the King George V's in terms of their gunnery issues at the Battle of Denmark Straits, etc. But also, the odds are you have vessels like Hood, Renown, and the Queen Elizabeth class at least upgraded 15-inch 50s as well. In which case, you have a lot of very capable vessels. So the thing is, whilst you could argue that individually the Nell rods are more survivable than the 53s, they are more survivable in terms of being battleships and being heavily armoured. In terms of operational utility and consequences on the wider fleet, the 15-inch 50s of the F3s would have been a massive consequence and a massive roll-on. So that's that. It's because small escorts aren't sexy like big ships. They look good as a status symbol you can show off. Well, that's true in big ships. Whereas for all signs, could Canada have built battlecruisers? No. No, straight off, building a capital ship is a massive thing. Building cruisers, you could build up an infrastructure to, but jumping from building nothing to building building battle cruisers is pretty darn impossible, infrastructure-wise. Brad S. Building escorts at a steady drumbeat helps to build up active and reserve experience and personnel for when you need it. Yep. Did the US and the IJN really think the Elsa-class battle carriers? I've seen it said that they thought this because of the all-forward layout. No. Actually, think about that. A Bismarck, Warspite with 28 knots of speed and armed with 15-inch 50s. Okay? Just think about the 15-inch 50 versus the 15-inch 42. Now, as I put us in long patrol, I've read 5 books on this topic. They've talked about them having 5 have talked about them. 2 just call them 15-inch guns, don't mention what they terms of the gun ratio. 1 calls them a 15-inch 48, and 2 call them a 15-inch 50. So I've gone to 15-inch 50 as the destination I'm using here. But, yeah. In nicest way, Scharnhorst and Eisenhower would have been annihilated in World War II far earlier on if they'd been the F3s. Let's be honest, if Rodney had had a theoretical top speed of 28 knots rather than 23 knots, and armed with the 15-inch 50s, in considering the range of the 15-inch 50 versus the 16-inch guns, the whole thing Gneisenau getting away would not have happened. Dalrymple Hamilton is basically going, "Hello, Gneisenau, you tried to run! How cute! Did I just pummel you?" And it's interesting one is this is the one where the cruisers don't show up, because whilst the cruisers would have been a useful addition for the Royal Navy also has the capital ship conundrum. And whilst the Royal Navy would have liked, I was looking at it going, well, I could argue the same in the counties for them, but actually the missed opportunity for the Royal Navy is this 15-inch 50 gun, which we know about, but it would have been an incredible enhancement for the entire fleet to work through. But even the F3 would have been an incredible advantage for the Royal Navy because it would have given them 5 fast ships. Okay? It would have given them 5 modern fast ships. Plus, they'd have had Tiger knocking around as well. But they'd have had basically 3 squadrons, which made up of a battle squadron of Queen Elizabeth's, battle squadron of ours, which have 5 ships, and then a 5-ship fast squadron. And Nelson and Rodney as extra fast ships becomes useful, but also you start to push up and you go, right then, so we want the Queen Elizabeths, the 3 Queen Elizabeths which are upgraded also could end up as 28 knot ships. And suddenly, that's a very interesting scenario. If Renown has 15-inch 50 guns, if Hood probably would have upgraded to 15-inch 50s as well, because that's a very easy upgrade to make on Hood, considering her size and space. And so she might have been upgraded early instead of Royal Oak, actually. And then Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and Warspite are all 28-knot ships with 15-inch 50s. That's a very capable force for the Royal Navy to build their fleet around. If the Royal Navy are building more cruisers in the lead up to World War II, with others being built during World War II, then some of them could have been used to build light carriers like the Independence of Saipan class. Potentially. But the Royal Navy... You also have the thing, if you have more cruisers wandering around, honestly, the British are less likely to build... They're maybe building less in World War II and concentrating more on the light fleet carriers in terms of construction. As for the small ships, yes, you can sell them off to... You can sell all the ones off to minor allies for influence and, you know, to help out with the wider security. Well, sort of science technology. In the interwar period, which countries had capital ship production capabilities besides the larger treaty powers? No one. Think about all the systems you need to be able to produce a capital ship in the interwar years, or at any point in history, and think about which nations actually build them versus which nations procure them. Soviet Union theoretically has the capability, but they don't have... Their infrastructure is being sapped by the fact that they're killing all the people who have the brains to do it and the skills to do it. So yeah, that doesn't work, and that's what Sovietsky Soyuz program. Not sure when that video is coming out on Sovietsky Soyuz, but when it does, basically it's me going, and then someone else died. So yeah, that's just not happening. Germany theoretically has the capability, but they have to basically rebuild it after the Treaty of Versailles, so they don't have it in the 1920s and 1920s definitely. Spain? No. They built the Hispania class and then they basically gave up after that. And that was in a British-owned yard, in Spain, which was basically bankrolled by the British government and Vickers. Yeah, there's no real options other than the Bega Pass. Yeah, Spain's not really there as an option. The Spania class, I don't think count. Yeah. There were some RM concepts which looked at building cruisers like the F3 on that, and their odd design sort of showed up. Why do that? Well, I'll be playing around with UAD probably tomorrow evening, so we can have a discussion about suggestions then. I'll be on Twitch. And I'll be on Discord after this. Again, I will have a little excuse me session to have a break between, but then I'll be on Discord for a bit. I released a Spetsy Soyuz class. Okay. I've recorded all of the Series 4 pretty much, apart from Key Ships Series 4, barring 1 or 2, which I'm going to record when I get back. If the F3 is successful, no need to build the King George V. Build 5 more F3s later in the line. That is an option which could have been done. It could have been the King George V would turn into the X3 successor class. Or they might have just rejigged the F3 design. And two, the Naval rods to follow up that was cancelled by the London Treaty was supposed to have a decent 4.7-inch dual-purpose mount. Yeah, that's an interesting one that comes about at certain points. The 1930s designs of battleships. If you are lucky enough to have this book and read through it, you will find a lot of interesting stuff in the 1930s. A lot of interesting stuff happens in the 1930s. There is a lot of wandering around. There's also a lot of work done on diving shells. There you go. That's what someone's talking about, as in the Nelson and Rodney versions, replacements. If I push that forward to that, there you go. That's the designs. Options being considered. 8-gun versus 9-gun formation. So it was a case of, does the extra gun more valuable than the extra survivability of the extra turret? In summary, so the Washington Naval Treaty is not that stupid in many regards. It's got some interesting points in it, and people are already pointing out in the chat the various issues between the fact that the treaty does ban selling of ships between each other nations, etc. But the biggest problem is that to take advantage of the things it does have in it, you have to be prepared to spend. And while some governments are certainly prepared to spend more than others, the British government is prepared to spend more than the American government. And the moment you have the London Naval Treaty, where you have limitations on the number of crews, etc., they go right up to those treaty limits as quickly as they can get there. The reality is, if they're not prepared, if the governments aren't prepared to spend, the treaties provide a large excuse for not spending. And I thought this was interesting because it shows the signatory delegates at the table. This picture does. But it shows the wider delegations that they bring with them to advise and listen in. And it shows the wider audience watching on. And part of the Washington Naval Treaty process. It's a big thing. They are big groups there. But still, they are trying to deal with a very thorny issue. And you always have to remember, decisions are made in the light of a large generation, a large number of people thinking World War I was the war to end all wars. In fact, you will find that phrase turning up in a lot of sources in the 1920s. World War I was the war to end all wars. And it didn't. It's the amount of hubris humanity can have in that we believe we have outgrown something like war. We've outgrown avarice. We've outgrown greed. We've outgrown fear. We've outgrown misunderstanding and miscommunication. All the potential causes of war. We have managed to evolve past them. Oh no, we have not. And at no point have we. There are lots of options for making it better under the treaty system, to work through the treaty system, and I've done a whole series on this channel on equitable treaties and how to make them equitable. And the thing about an equitable treaty is that if you make a treaty as equitable as it can be, it incentivizes people to stick to the treaty. Now, I would say that's always the best way of enforcing a treaty. Make it so that people want to stick to a treaty, or rather, it's within their best balance of their best interests to stick to the treaty. I would also say with Britain, a specific case, the British go for the 16-inch battleship of the Naval because that fulfills the maximum of the treaty. The treaty talks about battleships. The British treaty talks about 16-inch gun ships. We will build the very best we can build in this criteria. But honestly, it doesn't fit their needs. It doesn't fit their requirements. The F3 is actually a better fit. It's kind of like when I talk about the Americans and Lexingtons. Look at World War II and look at what happens. Look at how wars evolve. The task force system evolves. And then look at the American battle fleet. It doesn't fit with that. Look at the British. There is a reason why Force H is more often than not Renown and Ark Royal, or Hood and Ark Royal when it's not Renown. There is a reason why normally it's those ships. Because they're fast enough to keep up the carrier and allow the carrier to do the full operation. Occasionally Rodney and Nelson turn up, but that's when they really need some big hitting power. Well, imagine a scenario where you have the F3s, well, Nelson and Rodney are F3s, with 15-inch 50s, and able to do 28 plus knots, probably. Imagine that. What happens then? Let's consider the other scenario. Let's consider you have both of those with Ark Royal and a couple of Italian capital ships show up. Now, historically, when Ark Royal was on her own, she had to run away scalpish. When she was with Renown, Renown started to put a drop off speed on purpose so she would fight them on a solo. In a nice way, that would have been death of Renown. Two F3s armed with 9 15-inch 50s. That might have been a scary scenario for the Italians to deal with, because the Brit, especially as you consider those with 15-inch 50s firing green boys. Think about that one. Think about the damage those shells, those guns would have inflicted. That's going to be a very scary thing. And yes, they'd be good ships. The Italian destroyer ships would still be good ships. But... Brad S. Does that phrase, war to end all wars, show up in non-English sources in the 1920s? It shows up in a fair number of European sources and English language sources, but it is definitely what would probably be today considered a Western world perspective. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'm going to say thank you very much to everyone now, and I'm going to say I will be on Discord in a few minutes. There is a link down below. Patron suggestions will go for next month. Will go live probably next week at some point, because I was thinking about starting them off early this month. Because of my wandering around in the beginning of September, so it seems more sensible to run them in August. For September. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Warspite with a 15-inch 50 refit is not going to be nice. 15-inch 50s and 28 knots. The Warspite is a Warspite which is just causing nasty pain to people. Thank you, Just Funk. Thank you, SteveClarke. Thank you, Brad S. Thank you, Rapid Razorback. Thank you, Leo Gazebo. Thank you, Rapid Ines Morrison and Brad. I think I said Brad. Did I say Brad S? Not sure. Colin Cameron, Duke of Betchton, Wayne. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, John Shea. Thank you, Al Zazuski. Thank you, Carl Gosbag. Thank you, Atros Verdun. Thank you, Stephen Richards. Thank you, Blackbird Maximus. Thank you, Longbow. Thank you, Colin Cameron. Thank you, the admins who've been on the night. Sean Mack. Thank you, Jan Freeman. Thank you, Jack Ray. Thank you, everyone who has been adminning this evening. Paul from Chicago, I hope you get better soon. Please stop making yourself ill. You need to start taking better care of yourself, man. Thank you, Geo Guy. Thank you, IO2. Thank you, everyone who's been commenting and chatting away. Thank you, everyone who's been watching. Hope you enjoyed the videos. And thank you, Paul MS. Take care, everyone, and have a nice evening.